Alrighty, we are back. Turn off studio mode. The Pathfinders are back with episode 34. Nazeris, can you believe it's been 34 episodes?
Nope. Nope.
We have literally been doing this. We started in, was it mid-March last year?
March.
So we're at 10 months. 07 Night Cobb, thanks for coming and hanging out. Shempasta, thank you for the follow. Thanks for joining us. Yeah, we are coming up on a year of Pathfinder.
What? Did we just become best friends?
Yep. Oh boy. Red spaceship.
And I heard the sound. Did everybody else hear the sound? I played around with it, and I'm pretty sure I got the sound alerts to work. Blizzrad, thanks for the subscribe. Thanks for joining us. Sound check sat. Excellent. Glad those things are working. Aether Drift 369, welcome aboard. So yeah, we are Nazeris and I are the Pathfinders, and we are charting the way through all the nebulous information surrounding Star Citizen and its development. And
I swear by my pretty floor bonnet, I will end you.
That's one of my favorite ones. Nazeris, do you have it turned off, I assume?
Yeah, I don't hear it because I just hear us most of the time.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Of course, I had to throw in some Firefly ones. But nice. Yeah, Nazeris and I have a pretty interesting show. We are, we've been scrambling for ideas of what we want to cover because we've been waiting. We didn't get a monthly report last month. We're going to get it this next Wednesday, right?
We get two, the equivalent of two.
No, the monthly report's tomorrow for November, December.
The equivalency of 2 monthly reports in one.
Yeah, so we'll go over those next week.
That will basically be all of next week is those two reports.
Oh yeah, it's going to be nuts. It is every year. And everybody's hearing all the alerts. Glad to hear it. No, I appreciate the test. But then we also haven't had roadmap roundups. So, that generally our episodes throughout the month are, we usually have one that's a monthly report, and then we have multiple roadmap roundups, and then we fill in the blanks with spectrum pulses, scanner anomalies. And now we're like, oh gosh, we haven't had a monthly report in two whole months, and we haven't had a roadmap roundup since third week of December, and we won't get one until beginning of February. So we are we're pulling ideas out of our hind end, and but we're covering two things today that are there's a lot of information on them. Nazeris, as part of your timeline of the verse thing, you're going to be talking about Aegis Dynamics.
The idea started with wanting to fill out the lore, or trying to fill out the timeline, the ultimate timeline of Star Citizen, which I don't
ultimate
have
timeline. I need to remember the
ultimate timeline.
To remember to call it that.
Let's see, where is the? Oh god, I have so many tabs today.
Nazeris, are you saying that you don't have all your tabs organized right now?
I have them actually organized pretty well. I don't know if this is like a public link. Tree, can you test this for me?
Are you putting it in Discord?
Can you access that? Can you see it in all its glory as it stands? If so, I can check it into Twitch. All right, so this is the ultimate timeline. It is definitely not complete. It is the baby ultimate timeline, as we used to call the PTU, the baby PTU. We haven't called it the baby PTU in so long. The baby PU, not baby PTU. Anyway, so the idea came from I started working through the manufacturers. I'm like, wow, I should probably go in and I wanted to put in every single ship release onto this timeline because it's part of the ultimate timeline. So I'm like, okay, let's start with Aegis ships. And then my brain exploded because I needed to go through every single Aegis ship and track down their release dates, and not all of them are as clear cut. Actually, depending on the sources you go to, the Aegis Avenger has most of the references for the Avenger have sometime in the 26th century, and only a couple of them have the actual date it came out. So it's not just as simple as going to a single page and finding everything. So anyway, that's how it started. And I've also tried to convince Paul to let me on his lore-centric podcast. So 2 birds, 1 stone. I'm like, okay, let's do a... Oh, and the third point of reference to start this whole project was I wanted to talk about something Star Citizen in a Discord with not Star Citizen people. And I just wanted somebody to ask me a Star Citizen question. And my friend goes, why is Aegis bad? So I'm like, oh, why are they bad? Like, what's the thing? Where do I start? So that is the seeds of this whole thing, and I don't know how. I don't know if I've missed much. I've been poring over almost 100 tabs of articles about Aegis, and this is only part 1. What I'm going to be doing today. Also, what I am doing today will be put into video form eventually on the channel, the Nova Forge, which we'll talk about in a second. But also the preceding parts. I'm assuming it's only going to take 1 more because most of the deeper stuff is covered, and there's not a lot of stuff to cover in the lead up, and there's not a lot of atrocities still to go. It's just kind of slight mention and then the downfall, and then where they are now. There's not a ton of like references for that. There's not a ton of stories. But that's going to be what part 2 is, basically finishing the story. Part 1 is kind of like the inception and junk in between. So that the next part of it will be a channel exclusive, so it won't come on the podcast. I just want to use the podcast 1 so we can have stuff to fill between the updates. And also, I want to make both my channel and the podcast kind of symbiotic. So there'll be some stuff that's covered on the podcast exclusively, and some stuff that will be covered on the channel exclusively. Okay. So, that being said, I should probably talk about the new channel.
Yes. By all means, go for it.
I've been thinking about this for a little while now. YouTube is a cruel beast that it is. And there are 2 things that absolutely make or break a channel: consistency and category, or focus, basically. And I've been running my Nazeris YouTube channel for 7 years. I've done everything from SimCity, Spore, Little Big Planet, Space Engineers, Star Citizen, the Fallen Order. I've done streams. I've done 3-minute videos. I've done 5-hour videos. I've done so much stuff. It's very unfocused, and there's a good chance YouTube has no idea what to do with it, so it just chucked it into the corner. So about 2 weeks ago now, I decided that I'm going to do exclusive Star Citizen content. No more Space Engineers, no more Little Planet, no more anything else. There might be a video off in the different times. So Starfield's coming out. I want to do like something for Starfield. I may decide to put that back on the Nazeris channel and just link back to that. I may be able to do it on stream. I have to get people's opinion. But anyway, the Nova Forge is the new channel that I'm starting. So how the intro goes is Nazeris at the Nova Forge. So the Nova Forge is either a ship or a place. I haven't decided which, but I'm going to make that into a thematic thing. And that is where I will be posting and streaming from. I believe I'll be able to start streaming tomorrow, which I'm really looking forward to, because tomorrow we are making a tier list of ships. Because 1, that's a thing, and 2, somebody tweeted out a thing, and
I think it was Gabs.
The Ravens in S tier, and that is not okay. Raven Intel needs to go away. I hate exclusive ships. And also, like, all of the industrial stuff is on the lower end of the thing. So we're gonna fix that. We're gonna fix that tomorrow. That'll be the big thing tomorrow. So the channel is going to be information focused, with little gameplay. I don't think we'll be playing a lot. We'll probably be testing out some things, but it's going to be very information focused, very imparting knowledge focused. So I'm trying to get, I will continue to try and get like as many people in to ask questions. People love asking Paul questions, and he constantly has to cut people off asking questions. So I want to like help alleviate that and answer some people's questions. That was what I'll be doing on stream. I also will continue to do my building a star citizenship. People seem to really be enjoying that. Like I said, streams should start up tomorrow. Should. I'm basically waiting on YouTube to say, hey, you can stream now.
Oh, is that?
It's...
I haven't streamed on YouTube, so is that what's the deal with that?
I went onto the stream on YouTube thing, and it said, "Oh, you have to request being able to stream." Like, that's strange. I didn't encounter that last time. And it said this can take up to 24 hours. I have to verify my count and so on and so forth. So the scary part about all this is I'm going from a channel with 588. Wow, that's jumped up almost like 50 in the past like 2 weeks or something. 588 subscribers down to what was 0 3 days ago. It is now up to 22. So those who like Star Citizen content, like my content, please go over there and subscribe over there. And we'll be doing a lot more stuff. We're going to be talking about the mule or the mule crane at the end of the week. So that's going to be the Friday's video. And as far as scheduling, is going to be streaming every day at 8 p.m. except for Friday or Thursday and Friday, and a tutorial video on Tuesday, and a mid-form, I'm going to call them basically your 10 to 20 minute videos on Friday, I believe. Yeah, I believe it's
like
Friday.
Releasing on Friday?
Releasing on Friday.
Okay.
So that is the plan. That is the schedule. That is the concern. The goal for the year for the channel is 1,000 by the end. So by December 31st, I want to have 1,000 subscribers, which does set my entire scheme back. I wanted my channel to reach 1,000 and be able to live off my channel, the Nazeris channel, by the end of the year. That's very unfeasible goal. So we're just going to work for good enough for this year and really try and hit it next year. Hopefully in a couple months we'll be able to start adding a third video. But that is all my news. That's all my stuff.
Set a goal for June and then push it back 6 months.
I'm not CIG. I don't do that. And also it's very bad for your mental health to make like too aspirational goals to overwhelm yourself and then end up pushing it back. That is torture on your psyche. It is really bad. So
finding a middle ground where you are setting a goal where you're pushing yourself, and you are not a scary deadline, but it's a deadline. I can make this. We're working on this, and it, because having it be challenging is its own reward. And you want to have that challenge. You want to push yourself, but you also don't want to set yourself up for failure when you don't meet those goals because you didn't have reasonable goals. And that's
right.
I forget there's like a 3-word phrase about goals, and they might have to be attainable, measurable, and I forget what the third thing is. I wish CIG was less ambitious when it came to goal setting, not less ambitious with what they're trying to do, but less ambitious with the timeline in which they try to heap upon their developers. Because like you said, it's if you or I were setting unreasonable goals for ourselves, it wouldn't be good for you. You'd lose sleep at night. You wouldn't feel good about what you're doing. And I can imagine it probably impacts the developers too.
Yeah. Even sometimes they do the voluntary crunch period. Even so, like there has been times where they have to kind of kick them out of the office.
I admire their dedication, but at the same time,
even with a bunch of
take a damn vacation.
Even with some charity streams, they'll they'll set the goal and then have to expand it. So if we hit 1,000 before the end of the year, I'm not gonna okay, I'm not gonna set a goal now. I've reached it. I've peaked. No, after we get to 1,000, it's whatever time we have left, make that the year-end goal. If we reach 1,000, let's just the stupid number in 6 months, then we'll shoot for 2,000 because that's just the next one up. And I've been told that it's exponential. I have not found this exponential yet because you need to be focused. What about float plane? So to do float plane, you need to be established already. You cannot discover on, or at least discovery on float plane is kind of hard.
What
if
is float
possible
plane?
at all. Float plane is Linus Media Group's video streaming service kind of thing. But instead of where you pay for the platform and then they dole out to creators, you pay per creator subscription. So it's a premium per channel subscription model. Which really works to bring in a lot of revenue for the channel, and it's super high quality content. Like 4K is blocked behind the paywall for viewers, like a higher tier thing. I don't know if that's for everyone, but for you get way better compression and way better audio, well, video and audio compression. So as far as like the technical side of it, super good, but having like it's not super sustainable for like literally everyone to be on that platform because you have to pay for each channel's content. So it's a site to it's more akin to Patreon than to YouTube.
Oh, okay. Float plane is a very interesting name for that.
The whole idea behind it was it might not fly, but at least it will float, or at least it won't sink.
Oh, okay. When North End Trooper said float plane, I thought you had come up with another like concept that you were going to make up in SketchUp, and I was like, okay, we already working on the bulk. What is the float plane going to do in Star Citizen?
No, it's float plane is the planes with the pontoons.
Yeah.
So it can land on the water.
I know what you're talking about. I just I had never heard of that regarding streaming and content creation, and so
I doubt we'll get.
I was relating it to you, not to. Yeah.
Access says I doubt we'll get real info until CitizenCon.
I think he's referring to his comment above about Nyx.
Oh yeah, maybe yeah. That's actually a pretty decent bet. Like well, actually, it depends on how much work they have in Pyro. If they start working, July something, start finishing Nyx because they're done with Pyro, we'll hear about it.
We will know in a month.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we'll know in a month when
we'll have a good idea. Because here's the thing, with a star system, there are upstream and downstream teams with producing a star system, and so there will be teams that will be working on something throughout the production of the star system, just like they do for a ship. And there will be other teams who won't start working on their part of the star system until the very end. Like we just got that video, was it an ISC, right? About the background audio for the Pyro system. That's because audio is a downstream team. They don't start their work on something until like the last quarter of production of it. And that like when everybody was like, oh God, we're not going to see Pyro for forever. I'm like, no, the downstream teams are telling us now that they are already in production on their work for Pyro. And so that means that a lot of the upstream teams who, a lot of their people, because the upstream teams will have people who are doing their work towards the end, just like on ship production. You'll have the people doing the, polish at the end within those teams. But a lot of those people on the upstream teams will be like, okay, we need stuff to work on. And so they can move on to, other star systems. Depending on where they are, what sort of polish they have, what other projects they have going on. So with the planet content, like the planet tech teams and the planet content teams, and the sandbox teams, they are working on things that are for all the places, underground facilities, asteroid facilities, further on space stations, continuing on with the outposts and, homesteads and all that. And they'll continue to work on those things, but they'll also have their teams working on the next environment they're going to work on. And we'll see whether they are going to launch right into that soon in the next month when we get the downstream teams, schedule further out into the year.
But currently on the roadmap, the Pyro system, plants, and mission setup ends at March. Currently. Nyx also has 4 main planetary bodies, and they're all dead. Like they're all rocks. So, and they're not gonna retcon the lore for Nyx because it's already been in the game.
Yeah. They have a gas giant. There's a planet there that has abandoned mining facilities. So like I talked about that in a lore equals gameplay. It's like, hello, they're working on underground facilities. We already know they're going to be in Pyro. They're also going to be in Nyx. Nyx is going to have lots of asteroid facilities because it's all over in the lore for that system. And I forget what the other planets are, but they're, they won't be barren, but the planets in Nyx are going to be similar levels of barrenness to the various planets in Pyro, some more than others. So they may, I don't know if they'll add moons just because do they need to, is it necessary?
I think after we have Pyro, the actual amount of gameplay space, like the game space, both on planetary and just space wide, becomes more or less irrelevant moving forward.
Yeah,
we already
they don't have to add moons just for the sake of adding moons.
We already have tens of millions of kilometers of game space.
Yep.
Like we don't need 50 more outposts on a barren planet to pick up a loot box or pick up a delivery box from. It's just unnecessary. What we need,
the theme of Nyx is going to be the space, because it has 2 asteroid belts. One of them is shrouded in a nebula.
Yeah, don't take a light fighter into Nyx.
yeah, it's big. The gameplay is going to be, especially with Quanta coming in and filling in the blanks and server meshing. It's like you don't need a lot of planets to have a lot of things to do, especially when you have massive asteroid belts filled with asteroid facilities and other stuff like that. So, but yeah, before we go too far down that tangent, and but this is a good thing though, because like eventually, what Nazeris and I have talked about and have wanted to do for a long time is we'd love to do a Q&A, an AMA type episode. And so I have to figure out how to make the feature work with the bot that I use in order to take questions. And but I am going to get that working so that way when we do an episode, we can take questions and then build up a list and then do an episode where it's just, hey, we're going to answer these questions, or we're going to talk about these, these 5 questions, these 10 questions. Or we can do an episode where we're just going to do a single spectrum pulse and then a Q&A, that sort of thing. But I just haven't figured out how to do that yet. Obviously, you can see that it took me a while to figure out sound alerts. So sound alert streamers.
Man,
yeah,
YouTube doesn't have any of this newfangled crap.
Well, if you're using OBS, would that not work? Or
well, YouTube doesn't have points.
Oh,
I can set up a Q&A, sure, because that's a thing now, so people can submit questions that way. But there's no points on the channel. There's so sound alerts don't work.
Well, I mean, you could have them for if somebody subscribes and stuff.
Yeah, I have those.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
But the like, because I'm not monetized, there's not a lot of engageable things on a YouTube stream. Like, sure, it could play something if somebody subscribes, but like, it doesn't mean they're on stream. They could have watched a video and subscribed through that video. It doesn't mean they're there.
Yeah.
That's the advantage of a Twitch stream, is they're right in front of that. They're watching you now when they subscribed. Not necessarily like watching a random video that you posted 10 years ago.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I think it's a good point to transition into your scanner anomaly if you are ready. And I'm
define ready.
And I'm going to transition us into our scene with a screen, and I found a little thing that we can play just for eye candy that's related.
So, all right, sounds good, because I didn't provide any visuals for this one. All right.
Da, da, da.
Okay, I was gonna say, like, that's server meshing. What are you talking about? Pretty, very pretty.
The
address, the the greatest weapon against humanity. I mean, anyways, that's actually at the end, and there's not enough in this presentation to actually get into how the Aegis was used precisely. But anyway, so what this is going to go through the beginning and the early middle of Aegis Dynamics. So this segment is titled kind of two different things. Tree came up with his own thing, and I forgot what you named it. Heroes or Criminals, I think it was, something like that.
Oh yeah, War Heroes or War Criminals?
War Heroes or War Criminals? The answer is yes. I named it Aegis Who because it's going to be a long-running series. I'm going to be going through all the different manufacturers, starting with Aegis because, like I said in the opener, somebody asked me why is Aegis evil. How do you pronounce Aegis? Well, you can pronounce it Aegis, 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 or Urgis. Basically, how Star Citizen deals with pronunciation is if you can pronounce it, you're correct. Somebody somewhere has pronounced it. How are you pronouncing it in lore somewhere? Because lots of planets, lots of different dialects. You go for it. Anyway, Aegis grew to prominence as a manufacturer of military spacecrafts during the First Terran War. Formed by Ivar Messer. Actually, that is incorrect. I have two starts here. Not formed by Ivar Messer, but he had a good hand in actually bringing them into public consciousness. They built orbital bombers, grew to public prominence after their infamous victory on Idris IV. When he ascended to become the Imperator, or first Imperator, Ivar Messer contracted Aegis as the UEE's primary source of military-grade spacecraft and defenses. During the Messer era, Aegis craft became synonymous with the ruthless, oppressive regime. So that's just the intro. Now we get into the nitty-gritty. Aegis was founded in 2532 on Cestulus Davian II as a merger between the Earth-based Aegis macrocomputing and Davian-based dynamic production systems. The former constructed computing systems for the burgeoning spacecraft industry, and the latter maintained 4 systems worth of production yards, including the specialized components factories on their home system. The goal from day one for these companies was to build naval spacecraft, and resulting company was tailor-made for spacecraft construction or contract bidding in an era when mankind was marshaling its forces. Just 9 years later, on 2541, the Tevaran War first broke out, or the First Tevaran War broke out. Now that this is just the event that Aegis Dynamics was made for, and in 2544, just 3 years after that, the first spacecraft, the Retaliator, rolled off the production line. This is the first one we know about, and right onto the front lines. Consequently, on October 1st, 2544, the Battle of Idris IV happened. This is the event for both Idris and the Messers. The Aegis Retaliator taking a decisive role in another victory for the UPE and for Ivar Messer. After that, the destiny between Aegis and the Messers were tied. The only remaining original Retaliator, assembled in 2567 and no longer flyable, is serviced serviced by the 58th Squadron reenactment cohort. I can read on the grounds of the Mohio. There we go. I can speak words. Museum. I tried practicing that word. That one's actually really hard. It's New Zealand, by the way, is where I forget the kind of language it is, but the people from New Zealand, that's what the language they speak. After the victory of Idris IV, the Retaliator became a symbol of the Navy and Ivar the face of the war. The next year, the initial specifications of the ship that would later become the Idris frigate, named after the Battle of Idris, was established by the United Planets Earth. So we are still pre-UEE. This is what is the United Planets of Earth. That is a big deal, and it will come back to us later. And by the Weapon Development Bureau, or WEPDEV. The frigate was part of a range of forward-thinking plans that attempted to imagine the form that Earth's military would need to take after the successful conclusion of the then-raging First Tevaran War. In 2549, the first prototype of the ship began its space trials, and after 3 years of development, pledged with typical bureaucracy confusion to outside observers, the ship was completed. The ship was completely different from the initial specification of a corvette, now a massive frigate spacecraft, massing several times the original proposal, mounting an enormous railgun, and carrying a fully functional space deck capable of supporting multiple chassis of fighters and bombers. With the design specifications being revised multiple times as the reality of the post-war empire became increasingly clear. Messer-aligned planners quickly identified the project as important to establish their own power base, and they worked carefully with Aegis and their other contractors. So basically, as the Mezzers took more power, they had differing things they needed from their ships, and so they made Aegis build the ship closer to what they need. What were the Mezzers' plans? We'll get into that again very soon later. I'm going through this way faster, so this is actually going to be quite a short thing, because I talk too fast when presenting. It's fine. In 2546, Ivar was elected prime citizen after some shenanigans with terrorists. He went on to, and this is not about the Messers, this is about Aegis. When he went on to completely restructure the government, first dissolving the tribunal, made up of a high secretary responsible for infrastructure, high command, a 3-person position responsible for managing each branch of the military, and a high advocate responsible for law enforcement. This is all the while bringing along his friends, Aegis Dynamics, to build ships. Why would a prime citizen that now owns the government need ships? Then renaming the UPE the United Empire of Earth, and then declaring himself emperor in early 2547. In 2551, the first and the lead ship of the Idris frigate, the UNE Idris, was commissioned in a ceremony at Aegis' newly constructed Idris System factory complex. The launch was attended by Ivar Messer, who presented a famous speech seen today as a prelude to him taking increased control of the UEE in the name of public safety. I feel like I've heard this song before. The initial factory constructed by Idris to produce the ships included 6 berths that would work around the clock. The first 6 Idrises laid down were all commissioned by Ivar Messer in May 2552 and began service tryouts, then extended patrol assignments later that year. So they are able to produce, out of these 6 berths, 6 Idrises a year. It takes the current U.S. military 4 years to make a single frigate. They moved fast. They had the backing of the government and the emperor, or imperator. Sorry, my bad. In 2555, first Flight 2 Idrises were launched. With the early issues resolved, Idris production continued at a pace, and powerful frigates quickly became a common sight around the empire. So these were no longer just used for patrol missions and for special events. This was everywhere. They were everywhere. Moving past the Idris, though, the Gladius development began in 2573, so just a couple of years later, as a replacement for the obsolete Eliho-Harman Stiletto Interceptor, which suffered from an inability to adapt to more modern shield components and faced increasing supply chain issues following the Eliho-Harman aerospace bankruptcy. The Gladius was created for service aboard smaller cattle ships like the Idris that weren't outfitted for full-scale aerospace operations. It was also the first ship to introduce a civilian-style modularity into fighter design. This allowed the Gladius to be quickly upgraded or outfitted for other missions without requiring longer stay in the hangar for retrofit. The Gladius saw wide adoption upon the rollout in 2579. Now, we're going to take a detour for the rest of this little bit to talk about some of the things that the Mezzers used these ships for. In 2587, a band of outlaws were hunted down, leading to the discovery of the OES system. When the officer actually found them, he observed that they were just trying to live outside of the Messer's empire. though stealing from passenger freighters. But when he reported his findings, they were not taken into custody, as most unlawful citizens are. They were told to get rid of them, and in the words of the officer, they wiped them out. They wiped out the inhabitants, caught them as they tried to flee the system. So they weren't just hunted down and removed and like dead or alive kind of thing. They chased them. They chased them in space, and what do you think they used? Aegis ships. Between 2603 and 2610, the Second Tavaran War was waged, resulting in the Tavaran leaving their culture and history and what is known now as the Purge and integrated into the UEE. Some still live outside the UEE, some live in their own kind of cultures in little pockets. This has a lot of bearing on some current events that are happening in the game. But needless to say, they kind of wiped the floor with them the second time. In 2638, the senator of Terra, Sen Kareen, proposed a plan for Terra to gain sovereignty from the UEE. What followed was nothing less than a complete annihilation of his life and reputation at the hands of Livia Messer III. They did everything up to killing him. We currently don't know his whereabouts, so it's possible that he was taken to a black site, assuming that he was actually captured. Though not directly Aegis, these events are a sampling of what the Mezers and their favorite ships have done across the Empire. That's all for now, for this episode, for this kind of part one. There's a lot that we gloss over, and there's a lot that's not really substantiated. And I wanted to make sure that there wasn't a ton, it wasn't just the ship history of everything. So, on the next one, this is we'll go into the height of the Messer era and the downfall of Aegis. As this and part 2 will be posted on the NovaForge YouTube channel. Now, I'm sorry, Tree, that I made that in like 10 minutes.
Dude, don't worry about it.
I spent literally all day compiling that.
It's good because like this is the beginning of a big project. You know, well, this is the beginning of one part of a really big project. You know, and here let's where did your let's close this and pull that back up. Because this is the timeline you're working on, and like it has all these little things. You know, when it comes to the tools that people are creating in the community for Star Citizen, you know, this is visually, you know, for me, especially being a lore geek, is fantastic. You know, because you can scroll through here and you can see the years. And then you can see all these little, I guess what would you call them? Little points.
Events.
Yeah, little events, you know, on the timeline in reference to the years, and they're color coded, straight out of a box of crayons. It's like somebody took a crayon and said, "This crayon means this," you know, and there's an event for something engineering, you know, or alien races, you know, and so. I mean, yeah, there's a ton of stuff to put in there, obviously, but there's already a ton of stuff in here, a lot of really great information, you know, and as you continue to make updates and stuff, you know, especially like I think one thing would be, you know, how they do the Galactopedia update. If you could, you don't have to make links or anything like that, but if you like made a list of, hey, here's all the things I added to it this month. You know, and you could do that when on one of your shows when you stream, be like, hey, I added all these different articles and here are the links and stuff. And, you know, I think it would get a lot of viewer traction to what you're working on, you know, which also brings you feedback, you know, and input. But, you know, the Galactopedia is great, but the Galactopedia is just here's all the information. You search for it by name or category. There's no organizing it, you know, by time. And you know I don't know how to put it, but the putting things in the frame of reference of when they occurred is like super important context, and having it visually makes it a lot easier for people to process how different events relate to other events versus just, oh, okay, I read about this event and then I read about a similar event, but you don't really you see the year, but you don't really process it in a way when you're going back and forth between like Galactopedia articles or something on the wiki.
Yeah, that is an excellent idea. So I've actually added a channel to my Discord. Star Citizen Ultimate Timeline news and updates.
Bingo. I am
so
going
that is where I'll post, just like the Galactopedia does its updates. The plan is right now, the first thought I have is to make sure I have the links to every article I add, as well as a just list of all the events that I've added.
I will make a thing so that my Discord follows those updates in Star Citizen news, because I think it's good stuff.
I should probably compile a document in like the no free time that I have of everything that's on there, so I can do like a version 0.
Let's see. How do I? Okay. Cool. So that leads us into our Spectrum Pulse, and so I've compiled a whole bunch of notes and resources, and obviously Nazeris and I have been the Spectrum Pulse is on server meshing. And really, it's not like we're going to go all the way back to 2015, 16, when it was just a table napkin, idea of, we can do this. We're going to talk about the more recent within the last couple of years information that we have, because server meshing itself has really been the production of it has really been over the last couple of years. And there's been a whole bunch of component things that are part of the lead up to server meshing that has been going on and in development for years, all the prerequisite pieces of technology. But we're really going to talk about server meshing in its most recent design phase and production phase, because we are getting into, we're getting to that point where, server meshing is, around the proverbial corner for Star Citizen. And it's important, Nazeris and I, I've talked about this before. It's important for people to understand what this means. And because people really don't understand, the gravity of how important things like PES and server meshing are, and how significant how significant of an accomplishment it is to make these things.
Yes.
Sorry, sidetracked by chat. So I'm going to pull up my notes. So the first, and this is not one of the, there have been a lot of spectrum pulses and scanner anomalies that Nazeris and I have done, by ourselves or working together, that have been, here is all the information, all the way back to the beginning. This isn't going to be one of those because there's too much. And I'll show you why once we get to that point, because there's just so many resources. But we're going to take it back to August 28th, 2020, which was sort of the first sort of current gen video from CIG, from Star Citizen, about server meshing, the core backend tech. And so this was a calling all devs. They don't do calling all devs anymore, but it's kind of like what Star Citizen Live is now, where they talk to they talk to the devs. Calling all devs was generally shorter, versus Star Citizen Live, where now Jared is interviewing people for up to an hour. And I kind of like it how he breaks it up, where, he'll have 30 minutes of this group and 30 minutes of that group. But on this calling all devs, and the link will be in the show notes. All the links for everything that you see up here is in the show notes. along with images if you don't want to click on the actual link. And that will be in the Google document that is linked in the YouTube video, and the YouTube video for this will be posted within the next couple days. So in this video, Jared talks to lead gameplay engineer Chad McKinney and lead network programmer Clive Johnson, who, as far as I could find, are still both working with CIG and still working very hard. They're actually, Chad McKinney and Clive Johnson are two of the more active devs on when it comes to the spectrum as far as answering questions, at least, in relation to what they do. And so this was, obviously it's in 2020. So this is before PES. This is when they were still working with the Pcache and iCache system. And we know that iCache came in Q2 of 2021 and didn't meet expectations. But the goals were largely the same for persistence related stuff. That what they wanted iCache to do is what they are now using PES for. And PES is a all-encompassing term for multiple services and pieces of technology. But iCache was meant to be the in-memory. So iCache was in-memory on the server. It was meant to be the in-memory intermediary system that connects the server and the clients to the on-drive persistence database on the back end. So it's kind of like how PES works with the replication layer and the entity graph, except for the backend system was not the same graph database, and iCache was a cache-based system that ran on the memory of the dedicated game server versus being a separate service. And sorry, I'm opening and closing my notes so that way I can see Nazeris' face and interact with chat. So that's how it was originally meant to be, is the iCache was meant to be on the dedicated game server, whereas now the replication layer, it's currently on the dedicated game server, but it's on the dedicated game server because each server is a shard right now. We don't have multiple servers within a shard. So the replication layer doesn't need to be on a separate service because it doesn't need to communicate with multiple servers. It just needs to communicate with the entity graph, the server that it's on, and the clients that are on that server. But that's part of where they're going. So we'll get to that in a little bit. But what happened is, so, in this video, and this video, I'm including it because if you want to go back and watch it, it's really good for providing context of what they were going for with iCache and how the R&D process really works, because you can see the way as Chad and Clive talk about iCache and server meshing and the other things. You can see how the R&D process sort of evolves and how they do research and development, and they build a prototype and they put it into action and they test it. And sometimes you get that far into something and it doesn't do what you think it's going to do. It isn't robust enough. And that's what happened with iCache, and that you can tell looking back, watching this video now, and I watch it 3 times today, maybe 4. You can listen to the way they're talking versus how they talk about PES now, in the last year or so, where they didn't anticipate this or they didn't anticipate that. And one of the things they didn't anticipate was the way that the persistence data, the way that iCache would have to communicate with server meshing and talking to multiple servers was not going to work with the way that iCache was written, with the way it worked. It wasn't going to be able to communicate with so many other servers and services. It wasn't going to have the bandwidth and the scalability that they needed. So it's a good video, and because of the context. The other issue is because iCache was meant to be it was meant to be an in-memory service on the dedicated game server or dedicated game servers. And so they were doing it that way. So that way each server within a mesh would have an iCache service for the entities that it needed to track. But the issue is if that server crashed, the iCache, you wouldn't be able to quickly spin up that information from that server that was part of that iCache, that cached persistent information quickly enough from the backend that they had in order for other servers to fill in the gap. So you wouldn't have that. You wouldn't be able to make it so that way if a server within a server mesh crashed, that the players who were on that server didn't notice that their server had crashed. It would be a significant interruption in their gameplay. So it didn't have what they called fault tolerance that they really needed. Back then it was the iCache and the persistent item database, and that was another one of the main reasons why they replaced iCache and the persistent item database with the replication layer and the entity graph. And so this is also one of the videos where they talked about how server meshing was going to work and what it was going to do in a way that was much more concrete than what they had talked about before in previous years, and the way it was laid out, because they were at this point, they were already in the production and testing phase in 2020. And I think that's something that gets lost on a lot of people who don't follow these things too closely. Is a lot of people think, oh gosh, they just now finished PES. It's still not even all the way done. It's still, and now they still have to do, server meshing. It's like, no, in August of 2020, they had already done a whole bunch of the R&D on server meshing. All the other teams that have all their stuff that connects to the servers were rewriting their code so that way their content, what they made for the game, regardless of what team it was, if they had a group of engineers on their team that worked on their stuff so that way it communicated with the servers, they were rewriting their stuff so that way it would communicate with multiple servers instead of just a single server, because that's how most games are written, where you don't have to worry about entity authority being shared between servers. Well, this is a novel. The way that Star Citizen is doing server meshing is novel in that way, in that entities, players, all this stuff, the authority for those things has to be shared between servers because of the overlap. When you transfer from one server to another within a mesh, you're flying from Crusader to ArtCore and you're transitioning from one server to another. There's an overlap area where the authority is shared between the two. And most games, everything would just crash if you tried that, because things aren't written. The things aren't written where their authority is, between multiple servers. It's a very novel and new concept. Well, they had been working on this. If you go back and watch this video, Clive Johnson talks about it. The work for server meshing and the myriad aspects of the game, working with it, had been initiated prior to this video. Like, he goes on to say that a lot of that work is already done. And he was actually impressed that the other, I don't know if it's, the way he said it, it's like, that almost sounds like a slight of the other engineers within the company working for the other teams. Cause he's like, I didn't expect them to get the work, done this quickly, but we're nearing completion of that work. And so, that's a big difference between server meshing and PES. PES was not planned. iCache was always the plan. They were talking about iCache and the Pcache for years prior to this video here in August 2020. And I'm not going to play it, but I'm encouraging you to go back and watch it, because it again provides interesting context, because people think that because PES has taken so long and still has a long ways to go, that server meshing will also take that long. Server meshing has been worked on prior to this event. The teams were already rewriting their code to work with server meshing prior to August 28th, 2020. They were well underway with that work. And they have been making new content, and all the new things that they've been making since then have been written in order to integrate properly with server meshing. The difference is with PES PES wasn't the plan. They didn't know until May, June of 2021 that iCache wasn't going to cut the mustard. They still, what I don't have confirmation of this, but I'm almost positive we are running, in 3.17 and the prior patches, we are running on the iCache system, because iCache is what allowed for persistence to expand back in 2021 over what we had prior. But it reached its limitations very quickly. But that's why we got the inventory system when we did, and the updates to persistence when we did, because we are running off of iCache. But iCache and the persistent item database, just they've already reached their limits, and they've talked about that in multiple videos where these servers are often crash due to just running out of memory because of the way iCache works, and it isn't enough. And so I'll point it out once we get to the roadmap links for server meshing and such. But with PES, once iCache didn't cut the mustard, they immediately went back to the drawing board. Like, okay, what do we do in order to make persistence work? And they came up with the graph system for the entity graph, and basically rewrote the entire backend, the entire persistence backend, to store things on the entity graph, and then changed the iCache to become the replication layer in order to address the issues that we talked about with the fault tolerance, with the scalability, with the performance, all those things. And then after that was done, and in the main game dev branch, which was like back in this last summer, that's when all the teams had to go back and rework all their stuff to make sure that the game worked with 3.18 and with PES. And so basically in a matter of 6, 7, 8 months, the entire company has done what they were already doing for server meshing back in 2020. That's when if you think about it, Clive Johnson is saying in August 28th of 2020 that the majority of the work to rewrite everything for the game to be to integrate with server meshing, they're already done with it. Well, persistence, PES, the entity graph, and the replication layer is a much broader system in relation to these things, and the entire company has gotten that work done in less than a year, when that work for server meshing is already done and has been an ongoing project as they make new things and add them to the game. So the doom and gloom attitude regarding server meshing, about how long it's going to take, really isn't warranted. At least in the regards to the work for server meshing, because the work for PES is going to be ongoing, because it is, they're still adding more services that were planned and they just couldn't get done in time. And they have to test these things and do a whole bunch of optimizations and such. But they're not starting from square one with server meshing right now that PES is in. The work for server meshing hasn't really changed with the addition of PES, the entity graph, and the replication layer. So for me, that is a point in the optimism category. But that's going to move us on into the next video. And this one is from the CitizenCon 2951, the digital CitizenCon, not this last year, but obviously 2021, where they had a half an hour presentation on server meshing and the state of persistence. And so this is the first one, because iCache came in with Q2, what are the Q2 patch? I think it was 3.14, 3.15 timeframe in 2021. Well, it's very impressive to me that going from releasing iCache and getting it into the game and us having the inventory system that we have now, to that they basically did that in I want to say, like, you would probably think that the network and persistent tech team, and Nazeris, weigh in if you've got anything you want to say on this, because I'm spitballing with this part, because I feel like CIG is kind of embarrassed about the whole iCache debacle, and so they've talked about it in a limited fashion. but they still, we wouldn't have been able to implement the inventory system that we have had without it. And so that tells us that at some point prior to 314, 315, the teams and the company knew that iCache wasn't going to make it. Well, that was,
and that's
go ahead.
That's like the difference between Star Citizen and Battlefronts, like whatever other IP. They go through this stuff anyway, and that's what the publishers don't want you to know. Is no, the development was perfectly easy and no developers left, and we kept all our talent and everything was perfectly streamlined. That's not how development
from beginning
works.
to end. Yeah.
Like the example I like pulling up every time we talk about something going wrong in development. Halo was a Mac only RTS when it started development. Like, stuff happened. They were acquired by Microsoft. They decided they wanted a third person, and later on in development, they decided they wanted first person. It was space, and just like was not the plan. So a lot of companies just try and fix stuff and break stuff and go with different ideas, all in the span of development that you just never see, and they just release the game.
Mm-hmm.
That's the difference in Star Citizen. Is you got to see them put forth the technology that didn't end up working. Like, we've been through a couple of these technologies. Like, the first version of the 3D hologram system didn't really work. And so they had to make an update. And I'm not sure if cards are going to be like the next version of 3D. I think
you're talking about
the
thing before the what they call it with are you talking about the UI on the screens, like the HUDs?
Well, the 3D element specifically, I know. I think cards is the third iteration on it.
I can't remember the name of the other one. God, I know what you're talking about, because I remember, they were all excited. However many Citizen Cons there were ago, and they were all excited about it. And then a couple years later, they're like, "Yeah, this didn't do what we needed it to do. It made it so there's a lot more work. It wasn't performant. In order for to add new things and change new things was a bunch of work. And now we have building blocks and."
Yep. It'd be nice if CIG more celebrated their failures, because they're able to be seen like, hey, this is what development is. We're showing you this.
Mm-hmm.
Like, if they I think they're having the same problem that the Twitter edit button has, which is the if you tell people, no, you're going to abuse this thing if we give it to you, then yes, they're going to abuse it if you give it to them. Like, they're making their own monster.
Yep. Yeah, exactly.
If they're like, no, don't talk about this, then what is everyone going to want to talk about? The problem.
Well, and they
so if you say, hey, this is our failure, this is how we're going to fix it, and like make a whole video about it and celebrate their failure, like one of the first things that they try to teach in game development is to fail. And there's a video that I think
they're doing better about that now, and I think that's because of Jared.
I think it's because of a lot of people, actually, not just Jared. I think
Jared helps. Likes to highlight that because he brings it up a lot.
Yeah, he's definitely loves the project, but fail faster. That's one of the things that is like one of the big things for like doing anything creative is to fail faster and get to a better result faster. So if you celebrate your failings, then you'll progress better.
Yeah, and that is the basis of research and development, regardless of what industry you work in. I do a ton of R&D, for medicine and what I do, and it's very different, but it's a whole lot of, okay, well, I have this problem, I need to solve it. I develop a way, I do a bunch of research on, how have other people solved this problem? What have they done? What have they implemented, in order to do it? And then I, try to implement it in my environment, which, is similar but different to these other, other agencies. And then, you measure the results and, hey, did this get the results that I wanted? No, it didn't. Okay, why didn't it? And okay, it got these results, but not these ones. And so, okay, now you tweak it and you go back and re-implement and retry, until you get the results that you're looking for, and it's, that's what research and development is. And this is an R&D project. But yeah, a lot of people, and it's not it's not anyone's fault if you're not exposed to these things. That's just, it's not your fault, but it's the, people need to be aware that, it's okay to not know, and it's even better to, say, yes, I don't know, I'm going to go looking for information. And that's why, like, Nazeris and I both love doing these sorts of things, because if you just watch one of these videos, it's like, oh, okay, that's good information. But when you watch the video in context with other videos and other statements and things that have been put out, it's why the timeline, the ultimate timeline of the verse is important, because those things in a timeline provide context in relation to each other. And that's why we go when we do these things, and like, this is why I said, we're only going to go back to 2020, because there's so much stuff on this timeline. We would be here for hours. But that the three big pieces that we're going to cover, and then some of the roadmap stuff and other things, all these things provide context in relation to each other. They are a mesh, but
a server mesh.
But this is another really great video, and I think, and I think what happened is a lot of people, oh gosh,
misinterpreted.
Paul Reindell, who is like one of the, Paul Reindell is one of the big higher up people for the back end technologies. I forget what his exact title is. He is the German Targaryen with the glasses, essentially. And a lot of people, I remember when I was watching this live, there were a lot of people commenting saying, I can't understand what he's saying. Can we get somebody who can, who English is their native language? And I was like, wow, that's really, really, really shitty, but okay. And but it is a thing. And there's, you can also tell that Paul Reindell is a little bit more nervous in front of the camera. He's the next video, he's actually just talking chill with Benoit from Turbulent and Jared, and he seems to be much more relaxed because he forgets that he's in front of the camera talking to the community, because he's talking to Jared and Benoit like it's a meeting or a Zoom call. But you can tell when he's in this video that he feels off, it feels off his game. But I so loved this panel because of the way they explained it. And we're, obviously we're not going to watch the whole thing because it is 30 minutes long, but I'm going to play a clip here in just a second to sort of emphasize a few of my notes. So we're going to relate this video and what is talked about in this video to what we have right now in live with 317, 0.4, but the whole 317 branch prior to PES. So this will continue, but be expanded upon with PES and server meshing. So currently in 317, in the patches before that, way far back, the game is made up. The game world, the entire simulation is made up of object containers. And actually, Chris Roberts started calling them zones in the latest letter from the chairman. But object containers or zones that are like Russian nesting dolls. And with you start off with a big one, and then with each subsequent doll that goes inside, it's smaller and smaller. So with each subsequent object container or zone is smaller than the one that is nested inside of. So if the entire Stanton system is yeah, North End Trooper, you are required to say for science if you fail and you still learn. For science. Agree, for science. Nazeris and I, we are doing this for science, and normally I'd be doing this for science and beer, but I'm all out of beer, and I didn't want to leave to go to the grocery store today because I had the kid all day. But yeah, so if you think about it, the entire Stanton system, and eventually when we have multiple star systems, the entire simulation will be one zone, and then within it will be multiple star systems, and then within each star system you will have the multiple planets, the planetary systems within them. And then within each planetary system, you have the moons, you have the stations, you have all these different things.
And the
And
planet
within
themselves.
and the planet themselves. And then on the planet, you'll have a landing zone or a outpost. Each one of these things are zones, and it goes all the way down to a single ship. A ship
Or a
flying
room in a
around in
ship.
space. Yeah, or a room in a ship is actually a zone. Um, and the way that the game handles even a character is similar to the way it handles the zones. In that your character with your armor and the item ports on your armor and such are handled in a similar way when it comes to the entity graph and persistence. But that's how the game breaks these things down into manageable, pieces that are, simulated on the server, as well as how they are rendered on your client. So currently, one server simulates all object containers and zones and the entities, NPCs, collisions. And when I say collisions, I'm not talking about your ship, flying into a station. That is a collision. But collisions includes like weapons. So it handles all those collisions and simulates them. One server does all of that by itself for the whole of the stanton system. And the object containers, whether it's a planet or a ship, or a landing zone, these are loaded when a server is spun up. The entire, and that is too much for one server. Agos, thanks for joining us. Thanks for the chat. First timer. It is too much for one server, and we are all well aware of that because a lot of times 30Ks are because the server ran out of memory because there's just too much stuff. They had to pull Delamar and Levski, pull Delamar and Levski in order to add Crusader, because of just too many entities, too many zones, for one server. Aether Drift, we're going to get to that. So hold that thought. Yeah. Don't be reading ahead, man. But so when a server is spun up, so you have now we have 100-player server counts, and so when a server is full and more people want to join, they'll spin up a new server, and it's basically creating a new fresh copy of Stanton at its what the designers would call like the brand new baby Stanton instance, and it'll load all of that into memory, but the entire Stanton system and everything in it, from its initial state, will be loaded into memory, from the backend, from the database. But it won't start the server won't start simulating aspects of the Stanton system until players load in and start going around and coming into contact with those zones. And I'm not going to pull it up because it's in here somewhere, but Paul does a good job of explaining to us. Actually, it's right here. So we're at 721. So remember 721. We're going to watch it because I think this is important.
When the game server starts, all entities and object containers within the solar system are loaded into local memory of that game server. These entities are not streamed in, we just store the initial state in server memory. When a player connects, we create a so-called streaming bubble around that player, and object containers as well as streaming groups that are visible from the player's point of view are considered inside this bubble. Any object container that is inside the bubble will stream its content, and any streaming group within the bubble will also be streamed in on the server and then replicated to the client. Entities are considered inside the streaming bubble if their projected screen size on a virtual 1080p plane is larger than 5 pixels based on distance to the player. So while a large object, like a moon, will be considered inside the bubble from far away, a small object, like a ship, will only be considered inside when it's much closer to the player. When the player starts moving across the universe, entities that leave the streaming bubble will become unbound, and the replication layer will remove these entities from the client. Entities that enter the streaming bubble will get bound to the client, which caused the network layer to replicate these entities to the client, effectively streaming them in. We call this technique entity bind culling because streaming on the client is driven by the network layer, binding and unbinding entities. If entities are not in any client streaming bubble, so no players in their vicinity, these entities are also streamed out on the server. They go back into a dormant state where they are not simulated.
Okay. So basically what Paul just explained in just a couple minutes is client-side object container streaming and server-side object container streaming, in that the network, the game, the server tells the client what to stream in based off where the client is, and the client moving around updates the position of the player in order to tell the server, hey, this is where we are. And so the server knows what it needs to stream, what it needs to start simulating because of where the player is, and then the client also knows what it needs to render, what it needs to process based off what the server is telling it. So it's a mutual relationship, but the only problem is you can see, we won't go into that in this part, that's the next part, but that's one player. And so it shows you why, like if, Nazeris and I are both there, back when they first implemented object container streaming within the game, performance for the game just shot through the roof, because instead of having to simulate the entire universe at the time on your computer all the time, you only had to simulate what was in that little bubble around you, what zones were in that bubble around you. And it's still a really big bubble, 5 pixels on a 1080p screen. So if something is 5 pixels on a 1080p screen, just barely visible, barely visible to the naked eye, your client will render it. They could probably, make it even less so. But that's what gets rendered on the client, and essentially that's what is being simulated by the server, because the server knows that at any point you could spool up quantum and jump to that point. But it's a really interesting thing. But the only issue is that's just one player. When you add a whole bunch of players to that mix, the server, and players start expanding throughout the verse, the server doesn't get to stream out and stop simulating things as much, and what happens is the server, instead of being able to stream things out that aren't being simulated and giving you that server performance back, the server still ends up simulating most of the game universe. And so it did provide some improvement, because inherently players will group up together, and so the more players the more players are grouped up, the better it actually is for the server. Because even if you're doing Xenothreat, if you're doing Xenothreat and everybody, every player on the server is at the Xenothreat object container zone, even though that loads in a ton of entities, and there's collision detection and other stuff to process, the server isn't having to simulate anything else. And so that's actually why it performs relatively well, even though it's a very complex operation. It's not by accident that CIG decided to make Xenothreat. That was an event that they're like, hey, we need an event that's going to do this as part of testing purposes. And yeah, players love it. It's a ton of fun. I love Xenothreat. It's also an amazing way to test their backend and their architecture. There's a reason they just did a Xenothreat test in the PTU, Wave 1 PTU for 3.18, because it's a great way to test PES and the replication layer and the entity graph, and test performance and figure out, okay, how many, what sort of, things do we need to change in order to maintain performance? And initially, it performed really well, but as more and more ships were exploded and, destroyed and everything like that, the servers started to bog down, but that gave CIG the information that they needed. So that really is a good explanation of what object container streaming is, server-side object container streaming is. and why this stuff is so important. But it also leads, it sets the foundation of why server meshing is so important. That's one of the problems to solve is, okay, in order to make it so that way servers continue to perform how we want them to, we need to spread the load. And that's what server meshing is. Let's see, back to my notes. But yeah, this is why server-side object container streaming, it did improve performance because the server only had to simulate what was being simulated for the players. But if they were dispersed enough, it didn't have as much of a bump. So if you were, if your players were covering 80% of the Stanton system, then you're only not simulating 20%, and that means you get a couple server FPS better, a small percentage better, and it really wasn't that big of difference. When you're talking about you need the server to be running at like 30 FPS, and instead you're going from, oh sweet, we were at 10 and now we're at 12. It's not that noticeable for players. And we talked about this before. The other issue is because one server simulates all of Stanton and everything in it. If that server crashes, all the persistence data that is stored on that server that hasn't been backed up onto the back end is lost. And that's why if you are the way that iCache works and the persistent data, persistent item database works now, is those things are backed up to the back end if those items are stored, essentially. So if you are, or if you have a reason for them to be updated. And initially it was if you landed at a landing zone, if you or on a station, or you logged out on a bed, and even that's not very reliable. Those were instances where that persistence information would be updated on the back end, so that way if you crashed, you would lock back in essentially at like a save point. And then they created the heartbeat system to add on to that, so that way every now and then it would sort of create a backup. But it wasn't a real-time thing. It could be minutes between, essentially, quick saves for your persistence information. And they couldn't expand upon that because iCache, and the back-end database as it was written just didn't have the performance available for it to do that. And that's another reason, problems to solve, why they created the replication layer and the entity graph in order to run PES. And another, let's see, where's that image? We're going to go right here. We're going to talk about we're going to listen to this clip and talk about the replication layer and why that's so important and why iCache didn't work. Because a lot of people don't understand why iCache didn't work. Why did it fail? What's the big deal? Well, you're going to see a picture. When I explain it to you with that picture, you're like, oh. And because everybody zoned out during this part of the presentation. And so nobody really grasps why this is so important and why we are where we are now.
The goal of server meshing is to allow multiple DGS instances to work together and divide simulation cost between each server in the mesh. In the best case, we can scale this to infinity by adding more nodes to the mesh. As we saw earlier, each server node stores the state of entities locally. If we want to mesh these servers together, we need to find an efficient way to synchronize state between each server. With our current architecture, depending on the vision of the simulation and the overlap, this would require a lot of synchronization points between each node. It's an exponential problem, as in the worst case, each node would need to talk to each other node in the mesh, severely limiting our ability to scale it. To solve this issue, we are separating simulation and replication. Instead of just meshing multiple dedicated game servers together and have them synchronize state between each other, we are introducing a new layer called replication layer. The replication layer has two major functions. It holds the state of every entity in memory and replicates the state to clients, but also to server nodes. I said server nodes because in this setup, the traditional dedicated game server becomes a game server node. This server node connects to the replication layer, very similar to a client, and only a subset of entities are replicated to that server node. Replication to server nodes is controlled by the network bind culling algorithm that we saw earlier, and is driven by streaming bubbles, and it works very similar to how it works on clients. The server node has certain streaming bubbles assigned to it, which will cause the replication layer to replicate entities from these streaming bubbles to the server node. Contrary to a player's client, a server node has the additional responsibility to execute server-side authoritative code for those entities, controlling AI, doing damage calculations, etc., etc. The result of this simulation is then written back from the server node to the replication layer, and from there it is replicated to all connected clients and other server nodes. Since streaming bubbles can overlap, entities may be replicated to multiple server nodes, exactly the same way how they are currently replicated to multiple clients if players are at the same location. To avoid two server nodes trying to simulate the same entity, only one server node can have authority over any given entity. And only that server is allowed to write entity state back to the replication layer. This is usually the first server node who replicated the entity, and other server nodes will only run client code on those entities. Basically, you can see a game server node as a client with authority to write the result of its local simulation back to the replication layer. Authority can transfer between server nodes. For example, if an entity leaves the streaming bubble of the current authoritative server, it is then transferred to the next server node that has this entity currently streamed in. Further, authority can be transferred between server nodes on demand in order to load balance the mesh.
Okay. So we're not going to rehash what he just said, but let's see, this picture. So with how iCache was going to work with server meshing, iCache would have been what the replication layer does, where the iCache on each server, on the memory of each server, would be sending that persistence information from that server to a neighboring server, that shared entity authority, and to the clients. And so you can see how if you had a mesh of servers simulating a zone like a star system, especially if there's a lot of them, how you would have a mess of interconnectivity that would severely hamper performance if iCache was having to communicate entity state about different things to multiple other different servers, and numerous other clients. It would cause just a ton of issues, and that this is the issue of it being able to perform at the level that they needed it to. Doing this wasn't going to allow it to perform at the level that they needed it to, especially if this server crashed. The information stored on the iCache on this server was now gone. Other than what had been backed up prior to the crash, on the backend database, that was gone. And so this is a really good visual demonstration of the mess that iCache essentially would have created for server meshing, and why they couldn't run server meshing with the iCache system and the database that they had before. And so let's see, we want, where's that?
721.
This image is the right one that we need. Or here we go. Yep. Thank you. So this is the replication layer. And this, the replication layer is an intermediary service. It's not its own server. It's a service that runs, within the shard. And this is why, server meshing, everybody refers to server meshing as just the dedicated game servers running the simulation, them being meshed in order to cover the system. But it's actually, server meshing really refers to all of these servers or services meshed within a greater server, within a shard, in order to perform a cohesive task. And so now with the replication layer, it's you have this intermediary service that communicates, between the clients, so information back and forth to the client to client, information from client to server node, information from server node to server node. It dramatically reduces that communication relationship that we saw a minute ago in the other image, in order to make it more performant, so that way information is transferred more quickly and efficiently. And because the because the replication layer is its own service, and it's also constantly communicating with the entity graph in the background, and it's backing up its own. The replication layer saves entity state, and it updates entity state, and so it's updating entity state to clients, to servers, and to the entity graph, all the time, constantly. And so if for some reason you lost the replication layer this is essentially a shard. So like if you can imagine when they do the first iteration of server meshing, and it won't be this many server nodes, but imagine that it is. And there's this many server nodes within the server mesh of a shard, and one replication layer communicating with the entity graph on the back end, and also to the clients within that shard. But that's what this looks like. Well, if that replication layer for some reason fails within the shard, that replication layer is constantly backed up to the entity graph, and they can spin up a new shard and spin up a new replication layer, and it will populate those servers and the clients with what they're trying to do. And that's the first iteration of what they're going for. There's actually a second iteration beyond that, and we'll get to that in a little bit. But it's a much better system, and it allows for a lot more persistence than what was available via the iCache and global persistence database system previously. Instead of just the persistence of owned items that are stored and stowed and unstowed. This allows for persistence of everything that players can interact with, which is just absolutely insane. Everything that is changeable by the players, and it has a state that can be changed, is what will be replicated via the replication layer. And a lot of people, when they heard replication layer, they thought that was in reference to the single shard that CIG is wants eventually. And that is part of it eventually, that you will have, that's what they're going for, where the replication layer will communicate with other shards. But it's not what's going to occur initially. They want to work their way up to that. But we'll talk about that more in a second. And so where was the other timestamp? So this one? Yeah, we're going to watch this one real quick. Wait. It's right when Benoit starts talking. Yeah, I think this is the right one.
Since we now mesh multiple server instances together to simulate a shared state of the universe, we no longer call this instance, but instead we call it shard. A shard is still a unique version of the universe, and we still have multiple shards running in parallel. However, the server mesh will lift our current hard limit of 50 players, and it will enable us to steadily increase the number of players we can support within one shard. It will take some time, and in our first version of server meshing, we will still have a very similar situation as we have today, with quite a few shards running in parallel. However, this technology is going to enable us to start scaling the universe to become a true MMO experience. There are some fundamental differences between a shard and an instance, and for this we need to take a closer look at the replication layer and talk a little bit about persistent streaming. Previously, the entity state was held entirely in memory on the dedicated game server. And besides some selected persistent player items, all that state would be lost when the servers shut down or crashed. The replication layer is fundamentally different, as the entire state of the universe is stored within a graph database. We call this entity graph, and it's an evolution of the original iCache. When we create a new shard, the initial entity state of the universe is seeded into this database. This happens offline before we let player join the shard. When the shard comes online, the replication mesh caches the state from the entity graph. As player connect to the shard and as we start to spin up new server nodes, simulation begins and alter the state of the universe. The replication layer does not only replicate these state changes to connect players and server nodes, it also replicates the state into the entity graph. Since the entity graph is a persistent database, the state of the shard is never lost, and even if the shard is shut down, the state persists and can be resumed at a later time. Benoit is going to show you some more technical details about the entity graph.
That's why I like to think of the replication layer as just a constant quick save for the entire universe. Everything. It's just constantly quick saving, and it's, and sending you the updated information to the client, to the servers, and to the entity graph in the back end.
Thank you, Paul. Get ready for a deep dive into the entity graph persistence database. The entity graph is our approach to persisting the game world. This is fundamentally different to what is happening today in the game, where only items you own are actually stored. Our objective is to be able to save the state of the replication layer, which includes all entities in a given universe shard, in order to provide a truly persistent world, where actions you take as a player can influence environments in the game world permanently. The entity graph, as the name implies, stores game data as a graph. This representation is native for the game engine because it is how internally those data structures the game uses are addressed and manipulated. Using a graph also has several advantages. We're basically storing and retrieving from a gigantic indexed list of nodes and edges, and those edges between those nodes are optimized in a sharded database. But in order to properly explain the system, we must first view the game world as the game engine sees it. Game objects are constructed of several game entities linked together in hierarchical structure. You can picture this as a tree, which is a specialized kind of graph. This is how the game engine holds and simulates the elements on screen as it is running the simulation. In a server meshing world, this is also how replicants hold the entities in memory for each of their assigned territories.
Not as in Blade Runner replicants, but as in the way the game replicates information.
For example, a ship is made up of several entities that make up different parts of the entire playable vehicle. Each part is parented to another entity until the root of the ship is reached. Each of these entity nodes.
This is also why the work for PES and the replication layer and the entity graph is what will allow for modularity. Because persistent entity streaming allows for this zone, the cargo bay, to be streamed out when you're at a station and you want to change the state of this ship. Allows it to stream this out, and everything that is within this zone, for, let's say a retaliator, and this is the, cargo bay module in the retaliator, you can stream that out and then stream in the torpedo bay module or the dropship module. And this is the parent, it will stream out the parent as well as all the child entities within that zone. So, little tidbit.
Parented to another entity until the root of the ship is reached. Each of these entity nodes holds properties with regard to what the entity represents in the game. The class of object it is, the item type, its legal owner, orientation, and of course its very precise physical location within the game world. Each edge in our graph qualifies the relationship to the parent. In the case of a vehicle, our edges store properties that tell the system which port is being used to attach the entity into the parent and what kind of attachment it is. An item port attachment, a zone attachment, many others. In a constellation, for example, the different major sections of the hull are entity nodes with edges to the ship root. We call this small graph of item an aggregate because it is a whole movable unit. The ship root in this case is called the aggregate root because it sits at the top of a logical object. You can think of what you normally call an item as an aggregate, with the aggregate root being the actual item you are talking about. For example, a first-person weapon with attached scope, mag clips, and laser sights is a small hierarchy of entities. We distinguish the aggregate roots from other nodes by giving it a label. Labels allow us to distinguish and rapidly look up and find nodes of a specific type, either when we retrieve parts of the graph or when we look up specific nodes. Those labels exist to allow correct reversal of the graph data when we query for specific things in the game world. Other labels include streaming groups, universe root, star system root. This allows us to really look up and index those types. But the tree depth doesn't stop there. Additional information is required for a fully functional ship. The insides of each of those structural entities have to be fleshed out. Object containers are the building blocks of how space division is achieved, which aggregates and what part of the hierarchy they're in. In fact, most major areas of ships are represented as OC entities attached to the ship root or another OC. The shape of this data actually takes in reality is driven by designers. Of course, then, each of those object containers also contain entity hierarchies as well, expanding to have the common static and dynamic entities you're used to playing with, like elevators, beds, guns, seats, gimbals, and others. In addition to object containers that make up the structure of the ship, other aggregates can also be attached within the hierarchy of our ship. For example, a rover parked in the cargo bay of our Connie will be attached as a sub-aggregate attached to your ship's cargo grid. Same goes for turrets, which are changeable and themselves expose item ports, allowing guns to be mounted. For each of those entity nodes, a snapshot document is also stored. This document contains all the runtime values, the game components attached to those entities. This data is the dynamic part of the model where game developers can persist variables on any entity in the game world according to the rules of a game component. For example, damage.
Okay, so he goes on and on. The reason this part is interesting, and I'm going to just distill it down for you, he's talking about the entity graph and the way things are written onto the entity graph and the way that information is stored. And the way, by using the entity graph system versus what they were doing before, it allows them to read and write from the entity graph a whole lot faster and source information faster than they used to be able to with the previous database system, which is, the other part of, along with the replication layer, that is going to allow for PES to perform at the level that CIG needs for Star Citizen, for the PU. It also allows for a lot better fault tolerance. So a lot of the bugs that people have complained about with ships not loading back in correctly, being all messed up, you load in and for some reason your rover just starts bouncing around and the ship then blows up in the hangar, all that stuff. A lot of those issues should be at least addressed in part by using this entity graph system because of the fault tolerance when it comes to reading and writing to that entity graph. So that's why this entity graph system is so important and why is going to make such a big difference for the game going forward. And obviously there's going to be a lot of bug testing and refinement to be done, but it's a massive upgrade over the backend system that we had before. Just incredibly huge. But that's all we're going to cover for this video. We've got one, let's see, was it this one? I think it was this one. Yeah. Nope, wrong one. Oops. So reopen, close tab. So they did 2 PES updates as part of Inside Star Citizen. The first was September 1st, and the second one is literally 2 weeks later on September 16th. You're like, wait a minute, why are we going to talk more about PES when we're talking about server meshing? Well, this one was really interesting to me because what they talked about in this episode is very relevant to what we've got going on right now with PES. But it's also very relevant to how server meshing will work with PES going forward in the current state. And we're not going to talk about a whole lot. It's just because I think it's really relevant. But it's one of the big things that really hit me is the the way recovery works, and they talked a lot about the login flow and how how you get logged back into the server, the shard that you were in before, and why they are doing things in the way that they're doing them. And it makes a lot more sense. Like if you get disconnected from your shard, or you log out of the shard, the server that you're on, if they made it so that way the login flow it tried to put you back on the same server, it tried to put you back on the same shard, it would be a unique and bespoke system relative to the way the game works now, and then they would have to redo it, redo all that work for server meshing. So it would be a whole lot of wasted work just to make 318 and PES work in a way that would try to get you back onto the same shard, when the system would be entirely different when we get to server meshing and fewer shards because of the way server meshing works. The other thing that I thought was really interesting and literally just came out in the PTU that just got released like an hour or two ago, and it's in the patch notes, but they talked about how currently with prior to today with PES, it didn't have the ability to if a server crashed, the replication layer didn't have the ability to reload. Like, the server crashed and you're out in the middle of space and you were flying around in your ship, the replication layer at that point didn't have the ability to reload you back where you were, because you didn't do what was called entity stow. And entity stow is where if you store something into inventory, if you're on a ship and you move an item, if you have an item equipped on your back, a weapon equipped on your back, it is in an inventory. If you go onto a ship and then you move that item into a ship's inventory, it's in that inventory. If you store your ship when you get to a station, that's stored in inventory. If you have a weapon on your back and you're in a ship and you are parked out in the middle of space or on a planet somewhere and you go bedlog, that is what's called entity stow, and you're stowing an entity within an inventory. It doesn't have to be like your actual game inventory you interact with, but it's what they refer to as an inventory. And sometimes it's something you can see, and interact with, and other times it's things just on the back end. Like when you log out, you don't see your ship stored, somewhere after you log out, but it is stowed on the back end. Well, they just updated it today, so that way the replication layer, if you crash, or the game crashes, you have a 30K, the replication layer has the ability to restore you back to where you were before the crash, from essentially the previous quick save, just before the crash, which is amazing. That is the 30K crash protection we've all been hoping for and waiting for so long. It's now here, and it isn't just when you land at a station or at a landing zone or when you bedlog. It's all the time, which is amazing. That's what we want. But this is also just a intermediate fix until they get to the point where there are enough servers within a server mesh where if your server that you're on crashes, the next closest server that has authority over a neighboring area will assume entity authority for your ship and everything everything within it, and so you won't notice the crash. But the fact that we are getting this 30K crash protection, and being it'll take a minute, but what their plan was in this video they talked about is how if your server crashed, it takes a couple minutes to spin back up essentially a new shard to load, that replication layer back with, its previous most recent, state. But it will, if you 30K crash, end up back in menu, it'll give you the option to say, okay, I want to join my previous server, and it'll give you like a countdown timer before, you can move in. And, they were speculated it would take, maybe a couple minutes in this video. But that's why it's really interesting, because not only do we have that now, but their plan going forward in the future for what they call DGS, dedicated game server crash recovery, is so that way, if the server that has entity authority over you within a mesh, multiple servers simulating Stanton, and you're flying near Crusader, and that server goes down. Well, the server that's simulating, Daymar would pick up entity authority for you, and you wouldn't even notice the crash. You'd barely see a hiccup, and you would just continue along your way. So that is the ultimate plan going forward. But that's why two of the main reasons this video in particular are very relevant to the discussion on server meshing, because they talked about things that in PES that are very related to how server meshing will function in the future, and what their plans are. And what their plans have been, because what they're talking about in this video has been on the progress tracker since prior to this event. It's something that we have known about. So those are the three videos that I wanted to sort of, not briefly, but talk about first and foremost. But then we're going to move on to, we're going to look at the most recent letter from the chairman, and an incredible resource called The Unofficial Road to Dynamic Server Meshing, and then a handful of things on the progress tracker that are very relevant. Agos says, how many more games will want to buy server meshing from RSI when they get it working? That is a good question, because
the answer is 0, because RSI doesn't own it, CIG does.
Yeah. But Nazeris will be here all week over on the Nova Forge. When people say, "Oh, server meshing has been done before," not like this. It hasn't. Not even close. Entity graph systems have been done before. Yes, they have. Not like this.
There's only one company, one game that I know does anything near this, and that's Dual Universe.
And it's trash.
Oh, it's not that bad.
It is. They do a similar system, but it is far more rudimentary than what CIG is doing. But they also, because Dual Universe is a far more rudimentary game, they don't need their systems to be as robust as
right.
Star Citizen with its the microscopic levels of detail. So
yeah, they don't need to simulate everything. It's just a building game with massive PvE.
Let's see.
Or PvP, not PvE. There's no PvE.
We're going to move this over. And before I do this, I wanted to
I hope a lot of games build massive online sprawling world with server meshing. And it is quite possible. Right? Yeah, it is quite possible that the metaverse crowd lashes onto this kind of technology to start actually attempting to build out epic games might come knocking. It is possible. So here's to hope.
Okay. So we're going to look at a couple things, and I'm actually going to, Naz, you and I were talking in a content creator Discord about shorts, and I'm actually going to do my first short on this because I think it's important. But where'd it go? Oh, whoops, over here. So here is the letter from the chairman back in May. And so the goal will then be to get 2 to 3 months of testing on 3.18 in PTU for an alpha 3.18 release to live in late Q3. Well, obviously we know that hasn't worked, but he specifically said release to live in late Q3. Notice how the language has changed in the most recent letter from the chairman. Let's see, where did it go? We are aiming to put static server meshing and Pyro into the hands of players in the fourth quarter of 2023. He just said, put static server meshing and Pyro into the hands of players in the fourth quarter of 2023. He did not specify live or PTU or anything. And I do not think that was, I think that was very much on purpose because of how things have gone with 3.18. 3.18, he set specific expectations with 2 to 3 months of testing on 318 and PTU for an Alpha 318 release to live in late Q3. Well, not only did we not meet Q3 for live, we barely made Evocati for late Q4. But there is no mention of live PTU or otherwise in this thing. And so everybody's like, oh, there's no way we're going to have server meshing in live in Q4 2023. It's all going to be, it's like, he didn't say live. He just said into the hands of players in fourth quarter 2023. And if you watch Ray's guide, he pointed out something very similar to this in that what else is in Q4 of 2023? The first live CitizenCon that we will have had since 2019.
Oof.
So I think that it is very carefully worded in order to set expectations, but also set a reasonable and manageable goal for CIG to have 4.0 and server meshing, out to players, whether it's in Evocati at CitizenCon, which is I think what they're going for, or Evocati or PTU, or at some point in the fourth quarter of 2023. But he specifically did not say live. So set your expectations appropriately, but also realize that what has been reported to you, it has might be a little bit of misinformation because of the way other content creators are reading it. And that's going to set the tone for my series of shorts called Missed Information. Information you might have missed or was misinformation. It's going to be MIS''SED' information, because it's one or the other. Either you missed it or it was misinformation presented to it was presented to you as misinformation. So I think that was a very important note in the difference between these two letters from the chairman, because everybody had already read this one. They read this one with the same lens, and that is a
Part of the crew. Part of the ship.
it worked.
Part of the crew. Part of the ship. Part of the crew.
Part of the ship.
Part of the crew. Part of the ship.
I love that sound alert. August, thank you for the follow. I really appreciate it. Thanks for joining us here. But yeah, these distinctions are important. So we're going to read through this one real quick. I just had this up to contrast. So let's see. Is this the right one? No, wrong one. This one. We are aiming to put static server meshing and Pyro into the hands of players in the fourth quarter of 2023. Not in the hands of all players, but of players. So it could be Evocati, it could be PTU, it could be live. Any one of those things occurs in Q4 of 2023, then they will have met their goal. Paul Shelley, Astropub, likes to call this weasel words. The large caveat with this goal is that complicated engineering work that involves a completely new paradigm requires a host of new backend services, and technology is hard to estimate and schedule accurately, as the issues and problems that can come up along the way are hard to foresee, as no one has implemented this system before, and plans rarely survive contact with the users, especially at scale. This has been true for PES, as it is no secret that we were hoping to have 318 and PS released to live by the end of the year, as opposed to just PTU. Delays in finalizing 318 and PES impact the team's ability to start on the next stage, and we still have the unknowns of how PES performs after months of heavy load and people seeing exactly how much space junk they can leave around. You said they are not doing static server mesh. No. That is not what I said. Weasel words, August. They are doing static server meshing. They are not doing it in the way that you suggested. And the way you suggested was part of the plan years ago. The plan has been updated, and we're going to get to that here in a second. Static server meshing and what they are planning initially, and so far the plan has not changed since, let's see, where is that? This. So, how do I make it bigger? Open image in new tab. Zoom. Where is it? Okay. So server mesh MVP. I don't know why they put MVP 4.0.
Minimum viable product.
Minimum. Okay, very good. Thank you. So first release is full persistency 318 with PES. 4.0 second release, server mesh release. This will be a static mesh of one single, they said once, but one single replication layer, hybrid service, and 4 DGS nodes to simulate Stanton and Pyro. A DGS node is just saying 4 dedicated game servers simulating the universe. So 4 nodes for Stanton and Pyro. It could be 3 for Pyro, 1 for Stanton. It could be 2 and 2. This is the plan as of the letter from the chairman as of May, and it has not been updated. But then for they haven't changed what the plan is for the initial static mesh, but they do go on in the letter from the chairman, the second one, to explain what comes after the first static server meshing. Oh, okay, here we go. So this is all stuff talking about PES and why it's so important to server meshing. We will start with static server meshing, what we just talked about, where different servers are assigned to simulate different entity zones in a star system. Now, we don't know if they are going to go from just 4 servers simulating Stanton and Pyro to 8, and then 12, and then 24, or something like that. The issue with that is, and they've talked about it before, is by doing it that way, if it's static means that the server, so if they say they go from 4 to 8, and they've got 4 servers in 4 nodes in a mesh for Stanton, and each one simulates a planetary system. So 1 for Crusader, 1 for ArcCore, 1 for Microtech, and 1 for Hurston. And they can increase it further and further. The more servers they add to that mesh, when they say static, the server simulating that area doesn't ever shut down or stop simulation. It doesn't go away. And so if no one is in that simulated area, that server is just sitting there spinning its wheels for nothing. And that costs CIG money. Yeah. North End Trooper hits the nail on the head. Also, the cost for each server to be stood up. So even if, if they go to 4 and they run an event that goes for hours and everybody is, closer to the Microtech area because Xenothreat is running, and they've got servers simulating, areas of the game with almost nobody on them. That is it's a gross misuse of resources. And they've talked about this before in other videos where they need to quickly transition from static server meshing where the servers don't, it's a static number. There's always 8, always 12, whatever, within a mesh, within a shard. They need to quickly transition from that to dynamic, because not having servers spin up and down based off of demand means that you're just pissing away money and handing it over to Amazon. And I'm not going to pull up the numbers right now, but you can go and see the most recent financial report from CIG on their website for 2021. And you can see how much of their budget is dedicated to marketing and platform costs. And most of that money is for platform costs, AKA the back, the hosting everything on it, the Amazon Web Services. And that's why they are going to get to this part. So we'll start with static server meshing, where different servers are assigned to simulate different entity zones in a star system. Entity zones, sometimes referred to as local grids, are separate simulation areas. The inside of a spaceship is a different zone to the space around which the spaceship flies. A planet is a different zone than the star system zone where all the planets and moons exist in. And a landing zone can also be a different zone, nested inside the planet zone, nested inside the star system zone. That Russian nesting doll analogy we talked about. Pardon me. At first, the servers will be bound to fixed zones but we will quickly move to dynamic server meshing v1. The interesting part is previously when they have talked about their plans, it was just static and then dynamic, and they had speculated that they would start with a small static mesh and increase that static mesh. Now, they're not really talking much about increasing the static mesh, but quickly moving to dynamic server meshing, because the money that they have allocated for marketing and platform costs is partly from the initial investment money that they took back in 2018. And they don't want to spend that money on platform costs, because if they don't spend it on platform costs, they can spend it on marketing. What are they going to be marketing heavily in the near future? I know Nazeris knows the answer to this question. Go ahead, Nazeris. What do we...
Squadron, yeah.
Squadron.
Like, Squadron is coming up rather swiftly, and that's one of the main things I'm waiting for the update for is where Squadron's at.
Yep. And that's actually
thing.
A really good thing about CIG making more money than they anticipated, because it means that they are able to take that excess funds and use it on platform costs rather than dipping into that reserve and taking away from their marketing budget. It means they have more money for marketing in the future when Squadron 42 is getting ready to release. So the dynamic server meshing V1 and V2, this is really interesting because this is new. I have never seen them differentiate between these two in all the years that I've been following server meshing like a hawk that's hungry and looking for food. So at first, the servers will be bound to fixed zones, but we will quickly move to dynamic server meshing V1, where we assign servers dynamically to entity zones based on gameplay and simulation load. This will be a much more efficient use of servers in the cloud, as you only need servers where the players are, whereas with static server meshing, you have servers assigned to zones even if there are no players there. So this is a sort of hybrid, in that these servers will be spun up and down based off of how many players are in a zone, but the zone itself, the zones themselves, are fixed boundaries. So you might have a whole bunch of players going to Microtech, and as they're going to Microtech and landing at New Babbage, more and more players are in New Babbage, and they need another server to simulate New Babbage, but they'll, that server that's simulating the rest of Microtech will still be, simulating the people who aren't in New Babbage. And so they can spin up another server within that entity zone for New Babbage within the Microtech zone, just to, simulate that, but it won't be a dynamically sized zone. And then when those players leave New Babbage for whatever reason, and the population within New Babbage goes down, that the parent server for the entity zone of Microtech can handle the load, then that server for New Babbage will hand over entity authority for the people still in New Babbage over to that parent server, and then they'll spin it back down. And so it's much more efficient than static server meshing, where there would always be a server for New Babbage and one for Microtech. Hopefully that makes sense. Nazeris, did that make sense? I hope
Yep.
so.
Yep, makes sense to me. But I also know the stuff.
Yeah. But they have never talked about doing it this way. They've always referenced dynamic server meshing as being zones that are dynamic, both dynamically spun up and down, but are also dynamic in size. And they haven't talked about dynamic server meshing with fixed size zones. So dynamic server meshing V2 will take this dynamic assignment of servers one step further by subdividing entity zones into simulation islands. This is organizing the dynamic objects in one zone local grid into different groups based on which objects can collide with each other, allowing these islands to be distributed between servers to again help balance simulation load. So this is just going to, even narrow the focus even more. This is where the zones aren't geographical, but more based off of gameplay logic, whereas they talk about how if they can interact, collide with each other, if two, this is where a server could be a ship. Say you've got a fully crewed javelin flying around, and it would make it so that way they could spin up multiple servers within an area of space for just the capital ships, within an area of space, and then another, those are nested within another server simulating that area of space for the other ships, the fighters flying around. And that's essentially what they're talking about. And you can see how this will lead to exponential, you will already have significant improvements in player count and performance with just dynamic server meshing V1. Like, that's insane on its own. No one has done this. This takes it to a whole nother level. And that's why you have the ability to have an exponential increase in player count. So at this point, we will be able to handle tens of thousands of players all playing in the same PES universe shard. And PES universe shard is important terminology because he's saying tens of thousands of players within a shard. So say the West Coast shard for Seattle, or something. And, because or something like that, or the entire West Coast, US shard. And there's tens of thousands of players playing on that shard versus the East Coast one, but that is tens of thousands of players within that same PES universe shard spread around across the universe, not necessarily tens of thousands of players all in a same local area. That will get harder and harder as more and more people get into an area, but effectively you could have 1,000 players in a battle because of the way the island system works in subdividing it. Once we achieve static server meshing, we can open the universe of Star Citizen to other star systems, starting with Pyro. By having authority pass from one server to another, you'll be able to transition seamlessly without the need to log out of the game between star systems. And we already talked about this part. So before we get into a few things on the progress tracker, I wanted to show you guys in order to give you context of where we are with the development of server meshing besides what I've talked to you, but actually what has been shown to be worked on. This the fireworks, all that stuff. Eve does it similarly. It's not the same way, and it's also not as dynamic, and it's more like the way the dynamic V1, except for Eve is an infinitely less complex game to simulate. It doesn't hold a candle because Eve, you have your ship is your character, and you don't have, if you saw that bit back where they're showing off the constellation Andromeda and all the things that can have their state changed and modified within a ship the size of a constellation Andromeda, it's nuts. And so the amount of information and data being shared and things that have to persist and have their state persisting and being, their state being shared across the server and the back end into client, multiple clients at the same time. That's why when people are like, "Oh, it's been done before," no, the fuck it hasn't. Not even technically, yes, server meshing has been done, but the way that it has been done, the way that these things have been done before, is a very much more rudimentary implementation. Because in order to do it the way that Star Citizen is doing it, it will require years and years of research and development that costs a lot of time, of dev time, and developer money. And that's just the nature of Star Citizen and really Squadron 42. Because what is not known by most people is Squadron 42 runs much of the same, it runs services similar to what the services that are used by server meshing and PES, but on as a local service in order to run the game. That's why Squadron 42 is essentially the same game as the PU. It just is writing things, reading and writing and simulating them locally. Sorry, August, I wasn't, I wasn't poking fun or anything like that. It's just, this will get uploaded to YouTube, and so I want to make sure that people, on YouTube watching later, make the connection, make the distinction. So this is the unofficial road to dynamic server meshing, and I'm just going to drop this link in the chat right now. But it's, again, just like everything else we have shown you here, it's going to be in the show notes in the description on YouTube later. You can check out all these things for yourself. This has been around for, I don't know if it's been around that far back. I found this in like 2017, and I have been following it religiously ever since.
Published by Unobtainium.
Yeah. Unobtainium is an absolute rock star within the community. This is an amazing tool. Each one of these things you can click on, and it'll give you a description all about how this works. And that description isn't pulled out of Unobtainium's butt. It comes from sources. And Unobtainium has been collecting and what's the word? Documenting all these sources for years to create a cohesive understanding of everything server meshing and persistence, and all the services that support those two systems.
Yep.
Roadmap.
And he's still definitely looking for updating it. He did publish his last update in November 12th. But that was basically the last time we got any word on anything. So you best believe he's also waiting for the monthly reports. And I imagine he's probably working on updating it for what we just read, the second letter for the chairman.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is updated in November. So with the patch notes for 3.18, the letter from the chairman, all those sorts of things will get included in order to update this. But this is as of November 12th, 2022. And so but as you can see, there's a lot of information to click. I have read every single one of these things multiple times. I've gone and read every single one of these sources. And so do I have a comprehensive understanding of server meshing? No. Do I have a pretty dang good one? Yes. Just because all these things, I have read them and I've watched them multiple times because I find it fascinating. But along with it, compared to what we can see on the progress tracker, this does a much better job of illustrating where CIG is with these major projects and how the different components of those major projects work as part of the whole in each one of these descriptions. So the reason I've read all these things is because I was deployed in 2020 during COVID and was on lockdown in Afghanistan. So I had a lot of time to read and have since kept up on it. But so this is, I'm not going to go into all these different things, but the interesting thing that people don't seem to understand, again, when we're talking about the state of server meshing's development, where people think, oh, okay, now they have to start from scratch and get to work on server meshing, and that's going to take even longer than PES. Persistent entity streaming. Look at all these services that support persistent entity streaming that have had to be created in order to make PES work because the Pcache and iCache didn't cut the mustard. And some of these things in blue have already been worked on extensively as part of static server meshing in PES. The crash recovery and player reconnects system was literally just included in the most recent update to the PTU for 3.18. So this is first version essentially released because it's out in the PTU right now. So this is a good way to keep track of server meshing because a lot of people will just go to the progress tracker and they'll go to the deliverable for persistent streaming and server meshing. Well, this is like so many of the other things because persistent streaming and server meshing will continue to be worked on in various manners by various teams for years. all the way out to the multiple versions of dynamic server meshing that we just talked about, and up to single shard, potentially a single shard. This deliverable isn't going anywhere. It's not going to get completed anytime soon. You're not going to see it stop on the map, but you can see all the teams that are working on bringing these things to life. And the reason there's so many teams working on this is because so many teams had to update, like we talked about in these videos. They had to go back and rework so much of what their portion of the game does in order to communicate and function with PES, the replication layer, the entity graph. But some of these teams are like, oh, okay, sweet, their work's done. Well, no. The game services team, the network team, and the persistent tech team are all downstream teams, and so they won't get an update to they're only going out to December. They won't get their schedule out to March until we get the next roadmap update. But you can see the mission feature team and the vehicle feature team have their work. If you were to click on these and go to these teams and see their deliverable for this, you'd see that there's a number of engineers here and a number of engineers here. Pardon me, who are doing the work for their parts of the game in order for it to function. Well, PES is in. So these teams are doing work in order to make sure that their stuff works with server meshing. Do I have confirmation of that? No. Am I pretty positive? Yeah. But this deliverable will get updated when we get the next roadmap update that Nazeris and I are eagerly anticipating. The best way to keep track of the work on server meshing PES, more server meshing now than, oops, wrong one. Oh, okay. Yeah. So here we are. The vehicle feature team, persistent streaming and server meshing, 5 engineers working on making sure the vehicle features function with these services. Same thing with the mission feature team, 3 engineers and not the designer anymore, but 3 engineers making sure their stuff works. They're doing it part-time just to make sure it works. But they've been working on it for a long time. So if you really want to keep track of the development of persistent entity streaming and really more now server meshing, you go to this unofficial roadmap and then you look at these deliverables, and most of them are, if you just search for the name, most of them will be listed under the persistent tech team or the network team. And that way you can click on that deliverable and like the Atlas system. So the Atlas system, for example, add functionality to the hybrid service. Actually, we should probably pull up the hybrid service. There we go. So they talked about how when was that? They talked about it recently. I don't remember if it was I think it was in this letter from the chairman, how the next goal is to move the replication layer out of the dedicated game server. And a lot of people didn't realize that the replication layer would still be on the dedicated game server. And it's because, until we have server meshing, there's no reason for it not to be on the dedicated game server until you have multiple servers that the replication layer needs to service. And so that's what the hybrid service is. And it moves the network code's replication layer out of the dedicated game server and into a standalone service. This service is referred to as the hybrid service, as later versions of server meshing will split it into component services handling different aspects of the replication layer's functionality. The first version of server meshing will use the hybrid service to manage client and server streaming, replication of network state between clients and servers, and persisting state changes to the entity graph. Well, everybody's like, oh, great, that's going to take forever. No, they've already been working on it. This is, the work that they've done on it already, and they just haven't completed it because they didn't need to yet. It wasn't at a point where they needed to do it, but they've done R&D. They know what they need to do for it. It's going to take a little bit more R&D, and some production to get it implemented. But this isn't some sort of thing that's going to delay server meshing for 6 months, because it's not, like they are just now figuring it out that that's what they need to do. Atlas. Atlas adds functionality to the hybrid for what will become the Atlas component service of the replication layer. Atlas functionality splits the game up into multiple manageable regions, known as territories, which are then provided to the replicant function's dedicated game servers by the replicant and hybrid to manage and simulate. So Atlas is what will allow these servers to be told, hey, I need a server to simulate this area, and spin one up, and here's the information from the replication layer, in order to, this is what you need to simulate, and there you go. This is the service that tells the servers, hey, you're needed, and simulate this. And, hey, you're not needed anymore, hand authority of this over to this server. That's what the Atlas service is. Well, they've been working on it for a long time. Atlas service, shard manager, DGS crash recovery, player item shard transition, the DGS mesh node. Well, I had the Atlas service up here twice. I don't know why. Hybrid service. Scribe is part of the hybrid service, and it's not its own deliverable because it's included within these things. And why they didn't make its own deliverable, I don't know, but they mentioned it in these videos. And so they talked about, how it works and what they're doing. And so it's already been worked on. They just didn't need to make a separate deliverable for it. Same with Replicant, but they did make a separate deliverable for Atlas because it's a much larger service than these smaller sort of nested services within the hybrid. But you can see how most of these things are already on the progress tracker and have already had extensive work done for them. So in order to get to here, it is not as big as a lift as it was to get to here, especially because so much of this work has already been done prior to this even making it to even the PTU, let alone live. So that's why the goal of getting 4.0 Pyro and server meshing out to players, not to live, but to players in Q4 2023 is actually pretty reasonable. And I really think that's an important caveat to mention, especially because just recently, I think it was Clive Johnson made a post on Spectrum when people asked, what sort of caveats does this prediction take into account? And he said it's an ambitious goal, and server meshing is a research and development project. He didn't say it's still heavily in research and development. That's what people were saying. They're like, no, that's not what he said. He said it is a R&D project, and so they will implement some of these things as they're building a 4.0 dev branch for the game. And they'll have to have to test it and make tweaks and add things and change things and stuff like that. But it is not it is not where so many people are like, oh, they still have to do all the R&D. No. The R&D is largely done. The majority of the R&D is already done. In this video back here in 2020, they talked about how they have already meshed servers together and simulated what mesh servers would do together in order to figure out what they needed to do to make it work. That's how this plan came to be. So that's why all this information, in proper context, can really help set expectations appropriately, but can also help you manage your expectations going forward, because these things aren't unknown. It's just what is unknown to most people is how do you find the information? Now you have it. And if you ever have any questions about this sort of stuff and you want to know more, the links again are going to be in the show notes, but you can hop in Nazeris' Discord or the Nova Forge Discord. I don't know what you're going to call it now, or hop on his stream and ask him questions. He has all the same information. Nazeris has read this stuff just like I have. You can hop in my Discord and ask me. We're in 2 different time zones. So, Nazeris stays up late. I do not because I have a kid, But we're always happy to talk about this sort of stuff because we nerd out on it. But, in the meantime, here are the resources available for you and everyone else to make use of to better understand what goes into this, how it all works, where is CIG going from here and why, and why the predictions in the most recent letter from the chairman aren't the same as the ones in the previous letter from the chairman. Why server meshing, the project for server meshing, shouldn't be viewed in the same light as the project for PES. Because server meshing has been ongoing for like 4 years now. PES is a 1.5-year project that they managed to, throw together once they realized that iCache wasn't going to work. So entirely different things. But yeah, that is all I have for the Spectrum Pulse for server meshing. Nazeris, did you have anything you wanted to add? Anything you thought was important or anything that you thought I missed?
You got the most important one, that they already had a server mesh running internally.
Mm-hmm.
That they have tested it. They have a version of server meshing working.
Yeah.
Way back when. Like, they've only gotten better at meshing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
So
they have been continuing to test and implement and revise this plan and do the things, over the years. They're not starting at square one right now. Yeah, and that's the important thing, is to, manage your expectations using the information sources available to us. Aether, am I saying it right? Aether Drift 369. What do you think about this year? Do you think we will have server meshing in some form this year? I think that CIG's goal is flexible for them, and that the Weasel Words thing is that's, I think that, and everybody accuses CR, and they're like, oh, CR always makes pie in the sky predictions. No. These are not CR's predictions. These are CR asking the people making this, hey, what do you think is doable? What do you think we can achieve? And they say this, and he says, okay, I'm going to put that on paper. I'm going to hand that out to the community. And so that's why everybody uses CR as a punching bag, but it's not true. These were the expectations that other people gave to him. CR isn't a network programmer or a server architect engineer. That's not his thing. And because of what happened, I think that is why the wording in this is very, very different, and is clearly different, but nobody read it that way because everybody still had a bad taste in their mouth from this. So I think that server meshing, static server meshing in this year is highly probable. And when they say Q4, I think that they are being realistic in that window. It might be Evocati. It might make it to wave 1 at that in that point in time. It could make it to live. CIG doesn't know, and that's why they're leaving it wide open. But they're basically making a big target for them to hit versus a small target, with a more narrow window like they did before. So I hope that. Nazeris, what about you? What do you think?
I do think it is their plan, their internal goal, to hit something in Q4.
Mm-hmm.
But because of what CR said in his second letter, they know nothing basically about how it works. Like, they know the planning, they've done the tech can be done, but they know nothing until it hits a player server. When the second it hits that player server, everything must be recalculated to that point, because it could go flawlessly and they release it the next day. Yep. We could have an early Q3 or an early Q4 release to live, or it could hit player servers and just stop. Every server opens and then shuts down immediately, and then we have a Q3 2024 release.
Yeah,
that's the gamble with stuff that hasn't been done yet.
Mm-hmm.
They know nothing until it's actually used in the real world.
Yeah,
they can run all the tests they want
so much internally with 50 devs hopping on an instance.
50 devs, 1,000, 10,000, 100,000 bots.
Mm-hmm.
But players don't do bot things. They sit at the desk and buy thousands of picos, or they go and just run a javelin into ArcCorp. Nobody knows.
Mm-hmm.
Not even players. Players, they'll have these aspirations, but then the server or the game punches back, and so they have to react to the server. So not even the players know what the players are going to do.
Mm-hmm.
It's all reaction and reaction to reactions. And so I don't really want to put anything on this because I'm not going to be upset either way. Like, it's going to come out. It's going to be great when it's done. Then we're going to get a whole bunch of awesome content in the meanwhile and after it.
Yeah. I will be plenty happy between now and then, regardless, with what's coming in. Sorry, Aether Drift. Q4 for them is October, November, December. So when they are talking about their quarters, they're talking about calendar year, not like a fiscal year, if that makes sense. So and I'm going to go ahead and put this on a prediction, and we'll have to clip it. Blizzrat, are you still here? Clip this. But my prediction is that their goal is to have an internal working version of server meshing that they can use for a CitizenCon demonstration, and then refine that as much as they can internally, so that way CitizenCon goes fairly well, and release it to Evocati at CitizenCon, and then hopefully during Q4, because if it goes to Evocati at CitizenCon, then they can say they met their goal. If it stays in PTU the entirety of Q4, or they don't, hey, this is an internal build, we still have some tweaks to make, but our goal is to have it out to you guys soon for testing. That's still them reaching their goal. We are still seeing it, but I think that's what their goal is, to be at least able to run it internally for a CitizenCon demonstration, and then subsequently release it to Evocati at any point in Q4, hopefully sooner rather than later, but we'll see. Agos reminded me of the prospector in the Kraken commercial. What were we talking about? That's from way earlier. And Aether Drift asks again, do you have any ideas about how the PES test is going? Astroprobe said there is a massive amount of desync during Xenothreat, and this has to be fixed. So the Xenothreat was going really well, and the longer it went, the more entities that were spawned and not despawned, because things aren't cleaned up anymore. They don't despawn. That bogs down the server eventually, but the server becomes more tolerant. Would have been more tolerant with the server is more tolerant of that with PES and the replication layer and all that than it would have been with iCache. You couldn't have done it at all. And so the reason they ran Xenothreat is to test that, is to make it so that way they could figure out what the server can handle with a very localized event going on, and a lot of entities created and spawn, things blowing up and staying there, and then seeing if the server could handle it. So PES can cause desync because it's PES. It's not PES causing the desync. It's the fact that all those entities are no longer despawning in that area that the dedicated game server is having to simulate. And so the fact that the dedicated game server is still having to simulate all those things being there rather than them despawning after a few seconds, that eventually brings the server tick rate down.
It's not PES. It's the load of PES.
Yeah, the load of what PES allows for. Yeah, a good idea, a good point. And so it's not PES slowing down the server. It's the amount of entities that are having to be simulated that slows down the server. But that's why they ran Xenothreat. That was part of the plan. And a lot of the desync issues, and they talked a lot about desync in this episode back in 2020 of Calling All Devs. They talked a lot about that. They knew there was a desync issue, and they knew, they know a lot of what's causing it. The problem is they can only do so much to address desync prior to server meshing, because so much of what's causing the desync is the server FPS going down and not updating at the same rate that everything else on your client is updating at. And then, desync is you are no longer time synchronized between client and server. because the client is able to update faster than the server can. It takes you longer to process the server longer to process things than the client can, and the client is sitting there waiting for information. Well, the biggest fix for this is server meshing, and yeah, they need to optimize network code, but in order to optimize that network code, they really need to they can only do so much optimizations prior to server meshing, because it's really just chasing your tail, because a lot of that work would have to be redone once server meshing is in order to optimize that server client communication. And it's also an issue that server meshing is meant to alleviate. So I totally get what Paul is talking about, and yeah, they need to do something about it. But this is also one of those things where we're probably going to have to live with some desync until they get server meshing in, because server meshing is the biggest part of the fix for the desync issue. It's not so much the network communication. They have talked about, they talked about in this video how they were doing optimizations, and they have things that they know they need to do and they can't do yet. But a big part of that is waiting on server meshing, and that's why, like, certain times, you have people. I don't think desync is a blocker for the reset 318. I think that what they will, I think that what they will do, and this is speculation, but based off the way PES works, is I think that they will implement, and they talked about it in one of these videos, where they each entity has a this is not confirmation by any way, shape, or form. But after watching these videos and watching them multiple times, the way they talked about how entities, one of the properties that entities have like priorities. There's like a priority system, and so they could implement it so that, and the priority system is based off of groups. It's not just each entity has a thing. It's like, and all entities within this same group are of this priority, and then this priority. And so what they could do is allow for certain things to despawn over a period of time, as long as a player isn't looking directly at it, in order to reduce those entity counts, but still provide a level of simulation that is immersive. And so what they are doing, what they're doing with Xenothreat is how much can the server handle, and what do we need to dial back in order to make it function enough? They wouldn't have run that test if they didn't have a plan for how to manage it, but they don't want to dial it all the way back to where people are noticing a breakage in the simulation because too many things are culled. They wanted to be like, okay, if we do this, the most stressful simulation we can put on the game right now, in a single area. If we do this, what is the result, and how much do we need to dial it back using the plan that we already had internally in order to make it work? I think that's one of the things that gets missed by a lot of people, is like, oh, they do this, and CIG doesn't have a plan for fixing it. Yeah, they did. Of course they had a plan. That's why you have to have a plan in place in order to know how to test, in order to know what to test, in order to do that. They wouldn't have just tested it and be like, okay, this is the result. What do we do? No, they're not stupid. they knew what they were measuring, because they were looking, they had measures that they were going for in order to react to those results. That is what research and development is. I do that in medicine all the time with research projects and implementation of different, I guess, the simple way is just calling it interventions or processes, so I'm not doom and gloom about it at all. Do I think that the actual work of dialing it in is going to take a little bit longer than they thought? Yes. Live in January? Nope. I don't think it's going to happen. Live in February? Yeah. But the Xenothreat test is not a, they've got a long ways to go after Xenothreat. It's like, no, Xenothreat's a worst case scenario test. Whereas the majority of the time, everything runs pretty dang great. Like, I've played, yeah, there are bugs because it's a new system, but when I was playing, like all the PTU time I've had has been like, anywhere from like 15 to 30 server FPS. Like I haven't had it that good in forever, and it's because with PES and the replication layer, it allows for more things to be moved off the simulation than what server-side object container streaming could do on its own. And allows for more things to be moved off of server memory and back onto the entity graph, for permanent storage than what was occurring previously. It's just a more efficient system, but that efficient system needs to be optimized. I would love to see the whiteboard in the office that Clive Johnson and Paul Reindell work in to see what their actual plan is. It would just be absolutely fascinating. I'm sure Nazeris and I would have to bring a lunch and a dinner just to sit there and Google at it all day long, because it would just be interesting to look at. But yeah, no, I totally disregard the idea that CIG doesn't have a plan. They don't know what they're doing. They don't have an idea of how to fix this. And it's like, no, they're testing it because they know that they need to know how much fix to implement, because they have to balance, the whole realism in simulation versus performance, and so they're looking for that optimal point. But yeah, I mean, we've been going for almost 3 hours. Most of it was server meshing, and that's my fault, but it's an important thing. It's a big thing. But if you guys don't have any more questions, I really appreciate you hanging out with Naz and I. Naz, if you would please just reiterate what you talked about at the beginning with your new channel and your new plans, so that way anyone who's coming in later is aware. And
all right. So as Drew said, just to reiterate, I did restart YouTube basically. It was just described to me, and I had this feeling a while that if you run a YouTube channel and you just don't know what you're doing and you kind of do a little bit of everything, it kind of just throws you into the corner and doesn't let you really grow. So I started a new YouTube channel called the Nova Forge, and that is where I'll be continuing my YouTube attempt. And so we'll be posting a tutorial every Tuesday and a talking head video every Friday. So this Friday we'll be having a talking head on the mule crane, basically a supersized mule with a crane attached. I love the art of it, and I can't wait to talk about it. So that is the plan. We will probably, hopefully, assuming YouTube lets me, start streaming tomorrow on the Nova Forge channel.
Let me know how that goes and what they say, because I didn't realize that was the whole asking permission thing. I don't know anything about streaming on YouTube, so
I think it's just because it's a channel that's been built 2 days ago. So I don't know. I don't remember having to do it for my Nazeris channel. But assuming I am able to stream on my Nova Force channel, I will be over there tomorrow. If not, I'll just be on my regular Nazeris channel, and as soon as possible, I'll be switching over to everything on Nova Forge, with some updates left on the Nazeris channel, just so that I make sure to let everyone as possible who subscribes and sees stuff on the Nazeris channel to come over to the new channel. I should make a short about the new channel. Forgot about that. And so the streaming schedule is every day except for Thursday and Friday at 8 p.m. EST. Our regularly scheduled content for streams is designing a Star Citizen-like ship in the Argo manufacturer. Talking about Star Citizen, looking up your questions is one of my most favorite things. A little bit of gameplay when I have nothing else to do. We're also going to start branching out into other things. So tomorrow we'll be doing a tier list of all the ships in Star Citizen. So that is going to be super fun. I cannot wait to get into all of that. And so that is the Nova Forge, or at the Nova Forge, if you're using the tag system. And so far, I just have the how to get to your ship, new Babbage up there. So it's interesting. And the goal for the channel, is to have 1,000 subscribers at the end of the year. So that is what I got. And I hope you guys can join me.
Let's see. Gonna put the link in the chat one more time. Bingo. The Nova Forge.
The Nova Forge. Nazeris at the Nova Forge.
Excellent.
I'm leaning more towards ship. I'm leaning more towards like an Endeavor. Kind of like aesthetic. Not aesthetic, but like size.
Okay. I was like, wait a minute. No, you've been working on the bulk. What's going on?
No. I'm like calling the Endeavor the Nova Forge.
Mm-hmm. Ah, okay, cool.
Kind of like that.
Well, again, thanks for hanging out. Thanks for watching, everybody. Just want to remind you, and I probably should have mentioned this at the beginning of the podcast. I'm so bad about it. My channel, both all my content, both on Twitch and YouTube, is geared towards charity. I'm a veteran and currently serving in the Army National Guard. And so everything I do, all the monetization goes to stackup.org. That's why you see that in the top of the chat. And so all the subs, the ad revenue, etc., I donate to stackup.org. I just got notification of my first payout from Twitch, and so I'm waiting for that to hit my account. Once that hits my account, I will be screenshotting that as well as the receipt of me matching those funds up to $100 for a $100 donation to stackup.org, and then a whole bunch of watchers, listeners have donated live directly to stackup.org. You can see that we're at $275 raised of our $500 goal. So if that's a cause that you want to support, please consider subscribing on here on, I always get this all messed up, subscribing here on Twitch. And joining me whenever I stream. Come and hang out with Naz and I. Or for Armchair Admirals and Generals, we'll be doing episode 4 tomorrow at 8 p.m. Eastern. We're talking boarding actions, the yin and yang of boarding actions and damage control, with Atira and Night Cobb, who are active in my Discord, part of the Ammo. Ammo's the name of their org. But yeah.
Oh, that's right, Ammo, because they broke off from.
I always want to call it Armor, and I get it wrong.
They call it Armco. They broke off from Armco.
Yes.
Which is
there we go.
Morphs, a group. And
then you can come hang out in my Discord. There's a link in my Twitch, on the main Twitch page, as well as on my YouTube. And if you like this content, all the podcasts for Pathfinders and Armchair Admirals and Generals is posted on YouTube, both the full long form as well as the individual segments and shorter videos. And I also do lore equals gameplay segments. I'm going to be doing, when's the next one is I'm doing live on Thursday at 12 p.m. Eastern, so noon, because I'll be hanging out at home by myself, and those will be up on YouTube. And my first and so far only short form video is up on YouTube. It has been a great success, so I'm pretty pleased with that. But we are near 800 subscribers on YouTube,
Wow.
And so when we get to that 1K mark, I start getting monetization, which means more money for stackup.org. Yeah. So if you're not already subscribed to YouTube,
your channel is actually a good barometer of the difference between a 7-year-old didn't know what I was doing channel and I just started my channel only doing Star Citizen.
Yes, only doing Star Citizen, and Nazeris and I have found our niche, and I've that niche also apparently is likes what we do on Armchair Admirals and Generals. So I've taken what Naz and I do and expanded it, in a similar way, but not too dissimilar that it confuses the YouTube apparently.
Yeah. And you have the big bonus of having the military and medical background, which are two very big things in Star Citizen.
And things that I will be doing more of for my short form videos. So stay tuned for that. But yeah, I think that's all we've got this evening. Thanks again for hanging out with us. And Nazeris, if you want to, as always, take us away.
Well, thank you everyone for coming. It has been really fun. hopefully we won't have too much of a break. When are we doing the next one next week?
Yeah, monthly report.
Okay.
Still Monday. Yeah, I think Monday's still good.
Okay, so next Monday we'll be back. It has been far too long since we started. Since we had one. Has it been 2 weeks? Anyway. So we'll be back. Hopefully, we'll be much better off than we are now, with a whole bunch of stuff being uploaded in the next week. You now have our schedules, you have our Discords, you have our channels, and as always, thank you all for coming, and don't forget to be kind.
Good night,
everyone.
Oh, raid. Oh, how do you raid from the chat? Isn't there a way you can raid from the chat?
Do you have your not desktop,
hold on,
what is it called? The thing where you have the stuff. Dashboard. You have your dashboard? There should be a raid button.
I don't have it up. I will pull it up on. Don't leave just yet. We're gonna raid somebody. Give somebody a few Peoples. Watchers. We need a raid suggestion. Who should we raid, everybody?
Could be someone playing Star Citizen. Could be somebody who does Star Citizen content.
Raid channel. Let's see. Channels that I follow. Marcus the Way. I've only watched him a couple times. Enoch is playing Destiny 2. Any other suggestions? Anybody? Whoop. We'll raid Marcus the Way.
Okay.
I think he's playing Star Citizen right now. So let's see. Where'd that go? Tab. Start raid.
Okay.
And all right, everybody ready up? Yeah, we are pretty late. So ready to raid. 7 viewers are ready to raid. And raiding now.